Danielle, and thank you everyone for having me back. It's really good to be back with you. I'm assuming that many of you are are returning for this part 2 training and had my part 1 training back in the summer. I provided I provided the part 1 training, which is the primary training I do, back in July. And afterwards, I met with Shanice, and she said that there were still lots of questions about how to talk about sexuality with queer clients and how to sit in that space with queer clients and maybe help them explore their sexuality. And that there were also questions about the gender journeying and gender transition process. So we had a brief piece about that in the part 1 training when we talked about developing rapport with your clients, helping create a safe space. And I was really hearing a request to do a deeper dive into all of that. So I created this training. This is really a pilot training that I'm going to try out on you all. Because of the requests that came, and I'm really grateful for that. So I hope that you get a lot out of it. And like Danielle said, there will be points along the training where I will invite questions. So as this goes along, feel free to put those into the chat, and Danielle will read those to me at the Q&A sections that I name. And I will also invite at that time if people want to get unmiked and ask me questions. So there'll be time for that. And as well, I will offer my contact information at the end, as I did last time, and welcome feedback or any follow-up questions after this training is over. You will also have access to this material after we're done, and I will provide you with a bibliography of the resources. A lot of the resources that I discuss in this training will be on the PowerPoint presentation. Okay, so I'm going to just do a little reintroduction of myself before we get going. So my name is Aaron Testard. My practice is originally based in the Bay Area out in California. And as I mentioned last time, my professional experience working with the LGBTQ community, the queer community, started when I got an internship at a place called the Pacific Center for Human Growth in Berkeley. That is a prominent LGBTQ center in the Bay Area. And I started as an intern, but I worked my way up, eventually became the program director, and started doing trainings, doing supervisions, creating programs for the community. And from there, I went off into private practice and consulting, and I now practice out of the Bay Area in California, as well as in Chicago now. So working with the LGBTQ community and working with sexual and gender identity is my passion. That's what I focus on. I love to work with queer clients, and I love to consult about queer clients. And as a kind of a subset of my work, I also specialize in trauma, addiction, and chronic illness, which those particular issues are very common in the queer community. And you may have mentioned when I talked to you last time, I highly recommend that if you work with the queer community, that you get some training in a trauma-informed technique, because at some point you will inevitably be addressing trauma with queer clients because they're such a traumatized community. So, so that's a little bit about me. This is just a little notice I put up every time regarding scope of competence and scope of practice, the materials, the interventions that I bring up in this course. It may be outside of your scope of practice, so that's up to you to determine, if you are able to do, if it falls within your scope of practice. I have no financial conflicts of interest. My non-financial relationships are listed there. I am a member of WPATH, which is the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. I talked about that last time. I'll be bringing it up again today. If you're interested in working with the transgender community, I highly recommend connecting with WPATH. They have some fantastic classes, and just being a member of WPATH will keep you clued into what's going on in the world of transgender health. And they have regular conferences, international conferences every other year, which is really great. And I'm also a member of those other organizations, Gay Lesta, which is the local queer psychotherapy networking organization in the Bay Area. I'm a part of Mind the Gap, which is an organization for therapists who work with transgender children and youth. And I'm a member of the Queer and Trans Advocacy Network of the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapists. So here's an overview of our seminar, what to expect today. The first thing is I'm going to do a brief review of some of what I covered last time, just so we can get a little traction with where we're going. So I'm going to review some of the relevant queer history from before, and as well as the queer theory that's relevant, the principles behind queerness. And how to create a safe space. And from there, we'll kind of have a springboard for dialoguing about queer sexuality with our clients, how to set up that space. Then we'll get into the nitty-gritty. I'll talk about different manifestations of queer sexuality. So I'll talk about male-to-male sex, female-to-female sex, what I call gender fluid / gender expansive sex. I'll get into BDSM and kink, consensual non-monogamy, and also we'll touch on asexuality, since that's also a valid form of sexuality within the queer community. So I'm going to talk about all of those things, really to give you a kind of some context, some vocabulary, and some sense of kind of a sort of ethnographic exposure to help get connected to queer sexuality, so you feel more comfortable and confident having conversations about queer sex with your LGBTQ clients. And then after we talk about that, I'll talk about some interventions for exploring, accepting, and celebrating sexuality, because that is often a big part of our work with queer clients. And I will also mention, when we hit certain moments in treatment with clients where there are more serious issues around sexuality, what to do about that. I'll say now, and I will re-emphasize later on, that this is not a substitution for sex therapy, right? That sex therapy is something very, specific, and there are specific trainings for how to deal with very specific sexual issues. So this is not that, but this will give you, I hope, a sort of navigating system for when to shift to other forms of therapy regarding, sexual dysfunction, trauma, compulsion and addiction, those kinds of things. Okay, and then next we'll review gender affirmation and gender exploration kind of principles. I will talk about the steps of gender transition, which are social, medical, and legal. We'll go through each of those steps, what they look like, and I'll talk about how to support clients through that process. And the piece about gender transition is not a substitute for doing an in-depth gender assessment training. If you're interested in doing a gender assessment training, I will have resources for that. So what I'm going to talk to you about is, if you have a client that's already in your practice and you have an established relationship and they're talking about wanting to start transition, or they are in the middle of transition when they come to see you, this is about how you can support those already established clients through that process, and kind of give you a sense of that. All right, so this is part of our review. Some of you may remember when I did the history, I provided context for where we were today in terms of queer culture and queer thought. And I took it back to European colonization, because before European colonization, indigenous communities lived in the Americas. And those communities kind of created their own societal rules, guidelines, principles for gender and sexuality. And those did not match the European framework. The guidelines for those communities, in fact, were about tuning into, what people's identities were, what their sense of expression was, and really honoring that. So there was already a sort of what we would call queer affirmation happening in most indigenous communities before the settlers arrived. And once the settlers arrived, those communities were wiped out. And I explained that the European settlers brought what legal scholars now call the natural law model. And they imposed and they colonized Europe with this natural law model. And the natural law model is focused on gender and sexuality. The natural law model basically says this. Here, I kind of laid it out here. The natural law model says this, that physical sex characteristics equals gender. So if you're born with a certain set of sex characteristics, that automatically assigns you to a certain gender. You are either male or female. And then when you are assigned a gender, you are assigned a gender role. That means you are to behave and present a certain way for life. And when you are in a certain gender role, then you must have sexual intercourse with the opposite gender. And then sexual intercourse is for the purpose of procreation. So that's basically the equation of the natural law model. And so according to Western Europe, anything that fell out of that model was malignant to society, and there was sanctioned social ostracism, and it was also criminalized. So it came to be seen as illegal. Anything outside of this model was illegal, and on a spiritual level, it was a sin. And then in about the late 19th century, the field of science and medicine also was influenced by this natural law model via the specific field of sexology, right? Which we see sexology today as something very sex positive, but its origins are in the pathology of, sexual difference, right? So I talked about Dr. James Kiernan first coining the terms heterosexual and homosexual as pathological terms. So any kind of sexual desire that was not procreative was deemed, either heterosexual or homosexual. It just meant heterosexual was between people of a different sex, and homosexual what meant sex between people of the same sex. But it was still kind of pathological in origin. But later that same year, Dr. Kraft Ebing notably defined those two terms in the way we understand them today. So Dr. Kraft Ebing published in a paper his medical opinion that heterosexual sex between a man and a woman was normal, medically normal, and that homosexual sex was abnormal. And so that really set the foundation for homosexuality now not just being a sin, not just being a crime, but also being an illness, and set the stage for mental health providers, psychotherapists, to start to cure homosexuality, right? And it was also the start of sex and gender medicalization. So that model, influenced and pervaded, society for decades, until about in the 1920s, when Magnus Hirschfeld in Germany, I don't know if any of you remember this, but I'm just kind of reminding you now, Magnus Hirschfeld in Germany, who was a Jewish homosexual doctor, started to create a new idea of sexology, a non-pathological idea of sexology that was sex positive. Magnus Hirschfeld said that sex was not just for procreation, despite what the powers that be tell us. It's not just for procreation. It is also a way of people connecting with each other, of expressing themselves, and notably, as I'll talk more about later, of being creative beings, of being able to come into one's fullness of being. And so he viewed sex as holistically a very positive thing. And so he basically created from that mindset the first kind of sex positive, queer positive sexual organization, like, and it was called the Berlin Institute for Sexual Science. So it established all the things that are listed there that we now know is fairly commonplace today: sex and gender research, sex education, medical assistance for sexual and gender minorities, and safe shelter for sexual and gender minorities. And I also mentioned to you that in Berlin and in Germany, before the Nazis took over, there was a pretty prominent, what we would now define as a queer scene. People who were sexually or gender variant would come together and just be themselves fully. So I'm going to skip to the 90s for the purpose of our review, but you may recall that from between the 1920s and the 1990s, there was this tug of war between this more conservative, traditional approach that was about the dominant discourse of the natural law model and what sex and gender was supposed to be, that it was this kind of narrowly defined idea of what sex and gender was and what we were supposed to be. There was a tug of war between that and between saying that there is nothing pathological about anything that falls outside of that model, that same-sex attraction, same-sex desire is not actually, there's no evidence showing that as pathological. There was a tug of war between these two mindsets between between World War II and up into the 90s. And a lot of that tug of war had to do with activists pushing back against this dominant narrative and saying, no, there's nothing wrong with this other way of being in terms of sexuality and gender. So by the 1990s, some key things happened. First of all, the AIDS epidemic came to an end because of the antiretrovirals. So the gay community kind of went out of survival mode and was able to thrive. And at the same time, there was an increase in gay and lesbian media visibility. So more gay and lesbian images started to become more prominent, started to become more normalized. And then there was also more trans and bi inclusion in the community. And so the LGBT acronym was formed. So all of this was happening in the 1990s, and it also culminated with a taking back of the word queer. That taking back of the word queer happened in two ways. One of the ways was through activism, most notably through a group called Queer Nation, who would go into, their thing was to go into straight spaces and to be openly queer, to just to be open and non-apologetic about their gender expression or their sexual expression, right? They would go in holding hands with their boyfriends or girlfriends. They would wear what they wanted to wear, what felt true for them. So it was a coming out in a way that was saying, we're not ashamed of who we are. The other way the word queer was taken back was in the academic and philosophical circles through something called queer theory. And that was truly impactful on society and in the clinical realm. So queer theory, I mentioned before, has three influences. One is LGBT activism, which focuses on institutional power. The other is feminism, which focuses on systemic power that privileges men and masculinity, but in turn also oppresses other marginalized groups. The idea that the patriarchy is oppressive to many people. And most notably, queer theory was influenced by something called postmodernism, which was a big influence in general in the 90s. And you may recall that I said postmodernism also made a big impact in the realm of therapy. A lot of postmodern therapy modalities started coming out, like narrative therapy, which I talked about applying last time, and I'll mention today as well, solution-focused therapy. So postmodernism focused on a different kind of power, right? Not systemic, not institutional, but discursive power, the power of language and discourse. The idea that we form words over time and we form a sort of language and narrative, and that in itself builds power. And we start to assume it as a universal or objective truth. So prior to postmodernism, the mindset was one of modernism, which modernism implied that there was an authority that you listened to, and that authority told you what the right answer was. So if people came to therapy, right, or if a gay, lesbian, or transgender person came to therapy, then we were the expert they were coming to. And we were the person that they were going to listen to about what their sexuality and gender identity was, what their truth was. Postmodernism kind of turned that around and said, we're not the experts in the person's life. Our job is to sit with the client and help facilitate their own expertise in their own life. We're going to get curious with the client. And we're together with the client, we're going to deconstruct some of these dominant narratives that have been constructed through language that maybe don't fit their own narrative and their own sense of who they are. So there was this idea that reality was socially constructed, and when it comes to people in the LGBTQ community, their personal narrative doesn't match this dominant narrative, and that's what causes distress. And so that's a lot of effective work with the queer community is around just deconstructing those narratives. And so when we talk about sexuality today, there's going to be even more of that, because clients bring a lot of shame, right, that's been imposed on them through these dominant narratives of what normal sexuality and normal gender is. So I had mentioned the key tenets of queer theory, also what I'll say key tenets of queerness, which are kind of threaded through all of the interventions and the way we sit with queer clients. So these tenets, I encourage you to kind of hold as a sort of spirit of the work when we sit with queer clients. They are all very interconnected. Yeah, you really can't have one without the other. But if we kind of sift it apart, we can kind of identify these are some really key things about queer theory that are important that we kind of take with the package. Most notably is we deconstruct dominant discourse of sex and gender. We question it. We say, how, you've been told that these things are true, but when we really break it down, like how much of it is actually true versus like what you've been just told and take for granted. And then along with that, we challenge binaries. A lot of the dominant discourse is about binaries, this or that, either or, with no room for anything in between, right? So when it comes to queerness, we might talk about masculine, feminine, male, female, straight, gay. So with queer theory, we allow space to explore and tap into what is like most true for you. And we challenge binaries in all sorts of other ways as well. I even talk with queer clients about family, right? Family acceptance versus non-acceptance, right? It's not always black and white. We also challenge notions of fixed identities, because when people are in the process of exploring their own personal narrative, that could change. And I talked last session about, the model we work with is we allow room for clients to go back to an earlier phase of development, as they deepen their own work and discover new things about their process. So someone may identify as gay, but if a man who identifies as gay finds himself attracted to a woman, does he have permission to go back and revisit his sexual identity, right? So again, stepping out of the authority role and more into the client-centered narrative, we leave room for identities to be a little bit more fluid. Intersectionality is also a tenet of queer theory. So it's not just about gender identity and sexuality in a vacuum. Those things exist within the totality of the client's whole being, their whole story. So all the parts of their lived experience have an effect on their sexual and gender identity, especially other marginalized aspects of their experience. So when you consider race, ethnicity, ability, age, socioeconomic status, just to name a few, right? When we meet with the client, we're looking at the whole picture. Then sex positivity is another tenet, which I'll get into in just a bit, but that's going to be a big part of our talk today. And also political resistance is a tenet. And political resistance, especially in the context of postmodernism and queerness, does not necessarily mean going out onto the street and protesting, but we can be politically resistant in the therapy room, just in the sense of challenging the status quo with the client and saying, you've been told this is truth, this is what's real, but let's take a moment and question that. That in itself is political resistance. So hopefully, as I'm talking these all through, you can see how they're all interconnected, and you can't really have one without the other. But I encourage us to hold all of this in our heart and our spirit as we sit with LGBTQ plus clients. In terms of creating a safe space, I want to remind you of these because these really come back into play when we talk about sexuality and gender transition with clients. What I call the 3 S's. These are the grounding questions, the questions that can kind of, if we're feeling lost with a client or not sure where to go, we can ask these questions, and that can help kind of guide us and give us traction in session. So first and foremost, safety. Is the client safe with regard to a sexual practice, with regard to how they're handling their gender transition? Are they safe? Do they have safety tools in place? And if not, or if there are places where you're concerned that they don't, then it's important to address that. So it's really a sort of harm reduction approach. And then secondly, speech. Listen to the language the client uses about their sexual practices, about their gender identity, right? About their sexual identity, how they define themselves, and follow their lead. Use their language. I often joke with people in trainings and I say, I hope you're comfortable talking dirty, because some clients will talk dirty and we may have to talk dirty with them. That's part of how we build trust and let them know we're comfortable. I'm okay with this. And then third, significance. What does it mean for the client? That's going to be huge, right? I mentioned in the last training that I gave some examples of how one same thing can mean something very different to 2 different clients. So we'll get more into this when I talk about sexuality, but getting tied up and spanked is one client is going to be, is going to experience that as incredibly freeing, and it's going to be in the context of a trusting relationship, and he's going to feel more whole afterwards. But in another scenario, someone gets tied up and spanked, they're going to experience it as re-traumatizing. They haven't established strong boundaries in that situation. So what it means to the client really determines what direction we go in the conversation. And so just to review, when we talk about sex, we're going to get into talking about sex now, some important ideas about sexuality. Sex positivity is really important. So it's the idea that sex in all its forms is an important means of sexual expression. Sex is not just intercourse. There are lots of ways that queer people have sex, and I'm going to get into that. I'm going to talk about what that looks like. Sometimes sex roles are fixed. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes people are like, they're a bottom all the time. And sometimes people are what's called versatile. I'll talk about kink and BDSM and fetishes, but in the queer community, this is not considered strange in the queer community. and actually for that reason, a lot of straight people who practice BDSM and kink feel more at home in the queer community. But queer people have become oftentimes so used to deconstructing dominant discourse, questioning the norm of what's normal sexuality, that exploring kink and BDSM, they tend to be a little bit more open to it. And also open relationships. I will talk about open relationships, consensual non-monogamy. They're relatively common in the queer community. And I always say it's best not to assume monogamy. I think that's true in general, but it's particularly true with the queer community. Pornography is often considered normal and even healthy. There's even what's called ethical porn. You can encourage clients to watch ethical porn. That means porn in which someone has not been, it's clear someone has not been, exploited or manipulated or violated, that it was consensual. And there tends to be more openness about the sex industry. It's possible you may even have queer sex workers in your practice. There are kind of what are called tribes sometimes in the queer community, which I'll get into. And also remember, I will talk about sometimes wild sex, different ways people have sex create a sort of embodied eroticism. But sometimes for queer people, sex is just vanilla. It's, so again, we don't want to ever make assumptions. And also remember asexuality. Queer people sometimes don't experience sexual attraction, sometimes not romantic attraction, and they may not have sex at all. So and then I added this last time as well. This is a new idea, relatively new idea that's come out in the last couple of years in the context of queerness and in the context of sex positivity. And it's framing sex positivity through what's called a sex critical lens. And I think that's really important. So using a sex critical lens steps out of the binary of positivity and negativity, first of all, right? It doesn't, because to say that, sex is positive and, sex is all positive is also very binary. So being sex critical considers safety as an important element of sexual pleasure. So safety first, as I said earlier, is a really important thing. We want to make sure that clients are establishing safety all the time. So considering relational ethics, mutual consideration, the presence or absence of coercion, consent, super important. I will emphasize that later. And then the quantity or the quality of the pleasure. Like, how does this actually make you feel is really important. So considering when we talk about sex positivity, we're also looking at it through the sex critical lens. Okay, so let's get clear. When sex comes up with clients in therapy, why do clients bring up sex? I think there are a few reasons, and I have in parentheses queer, because, you could say, why do clients bring up sex? But since this is about queer clients, there are different reasons queer clients will bring up sex with you. One really simple reason is that it's in the context of their life and identity, and it's just what what they might report to us in that context. So in other words, this is a part of who I am, and I'm just letting you know, right? They might say, yeah, this happened when I was having sex with my partner last night. Or I was at this orgy the other day and I ran into this person, right? It's not really central. It doesn't, it's not something they want to directly address in therapy, but they're just kind of putting it in the context of their life and what they're talking about. Clients may also be testing our comfort level when they bring up sex. This may be particularly true with clients who are in phase 1 or phase 5 of their identity development. Phase 4, phase 5. So phase 4 and 5 is when clients are kind of in a delayed adolescence. And especially in phase 5, clients can be provocative. They want to make sure that they feel absolutely safe with you, especially if you're not queer. So they may be somewhat provocative. They may talk about their sex life in an explicit way to test your comfort level. I had a client recently say to me, he's a relatively new client, a bisexual man, who said to me, he asked me if I was gay. I said I was, but he said, he says, I'm glad to know that because I won't have to censor myself. He said, when I've met with straight clients in the past, especially straight male clients, they seem fine until I start talking about sex, and then I just kind of see, this wall go up. So, so it's possible that he may have been bringing up his sex life to test the waters with past therapists. And so part of what we're going to do today is hopefully help you get more comfortable with hearing about certain things so that you can kind of talk about it with more ease. Another reason clients will bring up sex is it's an aspect of their sexuality. An aspect of their sexuality, while not a main focus of treatment, may intersect with a presenting issue. So a client experiences anxiety in a lot of different contexts. And one context is their partner, wants to have someone else, in the bedroom with them to have sex. But they're anxious in a lot of other contexts as well. So it's a piece of their anxiety, but it's not the totality of it. It's not necessarily a central aspect of it. Another reason is they will actually want to explore their sexuality with you. Maybe it's new to them, or they have a new idea about something and they just want to bring it up to you. It's like, I've been thinking about trying out a sex club, and they just kind of want to talk it through and break it down with you, the pros and cons of that. And then finally, they might actually be experiencing a presenting conflict around sexuality that's either internal or relational, right? In relation to someone else. And it's related to their sexuality, usually in one of two forms. Either that conflict is an obstacle that's preventing full sexual connection, or they are distressed about a sexual desire or behavior. So an internal conflict maybe, I am afraid of anal sex. I have anxiety around anal sex. So that's specifically around sex. And it's an internal issue. So a relational issue might be, I like to watch porn when we have sex, and my partner doesn't. Okay. So it's an obstacle preventing full sexual connection, and it's relational. So distress about a sexual desire or behavior might be, I had a client who said, I'm into watching videos in which I'm being degraded, and it's all that, it's gotten to the point where it's all that gets me off, and that bothers me. Okay, that's an example of that. Or it could be something relational. I'm into this really kinky thing. I want to be, I want to be tied down and threatened. Something like that. Like have a knife held to my throat. My partner doesn't want that. My partner's really disturbed by it. So those are a breakdown of examples of what that can look like. So we're going to get into dialoguing about sex, but I just want to lay the foundation here about how we do this and the space we kind of create for ourselves internally, and then kind of what flows out into our relationship with the client. So I really want to discern between ethical curiosity versus the clinical gaze. And this is a distinction that psychotherapist Lucy Fielding makes in her book, Trans Sex, which is a great book, by the way. I highly recommend it if you're interested in working with sexuality with trans clients, trans and non-binary clients. But I think her principles very much apply to the queer community as well. So she talks about getting into a mindset of ethical curiosity versus being in the clinical gaze. Now, many of you may be familiar what a gaze is, right? We've heard of the male gaze. We've heard of the white gaze. We've heard of the straight gaze. It's that sense of you're kind of being objectified. And that's what the clinical gaze is. It's the experience of when clients sit with us and they feel like the therapist is not really treating them as a real human being. but more as almost like a science experiment. So when clients experience the clinical gaze from a therapist, they experience a sense of invasiveness, like we're just kind of prodding in a way that is uncalled for and unnecessary. There, Lucy Fielding describes a situation in her book where, you know, a supervisor is kind of just fascinated by the fact that she's trans, and he wants to hear more about it. And the way he looks at her, and the way he just has this look of fascination on his face, just feels so invasive. And she describes wanting to go home and take a shower afterwards. And that's often how clients might feel with this invasiveness. The clinical gaze also feels othering, like, you know, you're just like this other from this other world. And it can feel dehumanizing. It can also feel objectifying and fetishizing. And anyone who has experienced, has been in any kind of gaze from someone else knows and understands what that's like. So what it's important for us to track in ourselves as we talk about sex with our queer clients, and we talk about gender and gender transition, is tracking how and when we are in that sense of clinician mode and in the gaze versus a more of an ethical curious stance. So how do we shift to an ethical curious stance? And again, I'm just setting the stage for us to, you know, once we get into talking about sex. So we are doing it from an ethically curious place. Lucy Fielding kind of breaks it down into three kind of steps, three fundamental principles of ethical curiosity. There's dismantling entitlement. That's an internal process that we do as therapists. Now, the second is we seek permission. And the third is we treat the client in the room, the client in front of us. So I'm going to go through each of these one by one. So dismantling entitlement, that means that we are breaking down any kind of sense that we have of our right to know about a client's sex life and the details of the client's sex life. You know, what is that about? So the very first question that we should ask ourselves in the spirit of dismantling entitlement when we're talking about sex with clients is, who is this question or dialogue for? Is this for the client or is this for me? And one way to track that is by checking in with your body. Check to see, like, what happens for you when you become curious about something, when you want to know something. Do you feel a sense of excitement? Does your heart start to race a little fast? Do you feel a sense of titillation? That would be a sign that this is more for you and there's not so much for the client. But maybe you feel, on the other hand, more a sense of an open-heartedness, an openness, a real sense of care and curiosity for the client. So our bodies can really be our gauge and tell us, you know, the answer to this question. Who is this question or dialogue for? But when you feel that sense of titillation, that excitement, it's important to take pause and try to shift out of that. And then ask yourself, why am I asking this question? Or these questions? Why am I doing this inquiry, right? What is the therapeutic value of this? Let's be very clear about it. And then we also ask, what assumptions am I bringing? So last session, we talked about bias, bringing our bias in. Noticing when clients talk about aspects of their sexuality, where do we get uncomfortable? What for us is normal sexuality? The reason I think it's so important to talk about that natural law model is because whether you're queer or not, you've probably internalized it. You've probably internalized the shoulds and the oughts of sexuality, what's normal and what's not normal. So this is an opportunity to track, what is your sense of what's normal and not normal? And by the way, something wonderful about queering your practice, as I call it, meaning when you start to, even if you're a straight clinician or a non-queer clinician, you start to queer your practice and think outside of the box of sexuality. What it can do is kind of awaken one's own sense of erotic embodiment. So it can be, I would, invite you to just kind of observe that, how this starts to, as you question your own assumptions, how does that create more personal shifts for you? as you're more able and open to show up for clients. Another question is who needs to educate me? Part of the reason of this training, of course, is to help you get educated so that you're not depending on the client to educate you about all the aspects of their sexuality and their sex life. Just to know some kind of basic things of what things are. And there also can be a sense of entitlement in expecting the client to educate us about them. And finally, understanding and knowing your location of self and possibly bringing that up to the client. So I am cisgender, and when I sit with a trans or non-binary client, I have an awareness of that. And I might even check in about that and say, hey, we're talking about transsexuality, or maybe we shift into a client about talking to your body. I'm talking about your body. So just to acknowledge that, I want to make space for, if there's anything that comes up for you around that. As a trans or non-binary person who sits with me, a cisgender person, talking about this. And then the next step of dismantling entitlement is seeking permission. So the first piece of that is collaborative goal setting, right? We work with the client together around what are your goals. So when it comes to sexuality, sexual exploration, and then, of course, when it comes to gender transition, anything around your body that involves embodiment of your sexual and gender being, what are your goals? Let's make sure we're on the same page of what you're working towards. So there are no assumptions on my part. The other piece of seeking permission is checking in along the way. How is this dialogue going for you? How is this conversation going for you right now? So you can check in about if the client is experiencing any kind of invasiveness or objectification, and check in about that and have a conversation about it. And then finally, engaging in aftercare. So engaging in aftercare, Lucy Fielding says, is it's important for us as clinicians, after we have a conversation about sexuality or gender or the body, it may bring up stuff for us. It's important that we do aftercare, self-soothe ourselves, come back to ourselves. And then we also want to encourage the client to do the same. How can they take care of themselves after these conversations? And then finally, you treat the client in front of you. So avoid making any assumptions about what the client's into. It's a gay man sitting in front of you. Don't assume what they're into. I'm going to give you a menu of kind of things that gay men are into sexually, but talk to the person in front of you and learn about them. And also remember the client's identity constellation that has to do with intersectionality. So understand that when you're talking about their body, there are different ways that their body lives in the world, not just as a sexual being, not as this is a trans being, but maybe it may be a body of color, it may be a disabled body, it may be a plus size body. So when you talk about the body and sexuality, we hold the entirety of it, the whole identity constellation. All right, so I really wanted to set the stage as we start to talk more explicitly about sex. And I want to encourage us all to, hold that space in our hearts of ethical curiosity, that this is about human beings. This is about the people that we're treating. And this is about the real ways that our clients experience or long to experience embodiment and fullness within themselves. Okay, so before I go on, I will take a few minutes for questions, if there are any.
I don't see any right now, Aaron. What we have so far is a link for Lucy Fielding's
Mm-hmm.
for her book. Kelly
Great.
has inserted that for us, so thank you so much, Kelly.
Yes.
No, I don't see any questions. Any questions from the group? You can either put it in the chat or you can unmute yourself.
And if not, we'll keep going.
Okay.
Mhm.
All right. Don't see
Huh?
anything. So we
Okay.
can keep going, Aaron. Thank you so
Great.
much.
Thank you. All right. Yes. And I do recommend Lucy Fielding's book. Okay.
Hello.
So, oh, hello.
Hi, I actually do have a question. Um, I appreciate the information because this is very helpful, by the way. What about clients who, let's say they're like young children? Because I
Mm,
think that is an important topic as well, because they're a lot more sensitive to their sexuality because they're really trying to figure themselves out and discover themselves. And I had recently come into contact with a child who
mm,
consider
okay.
themselves non-binary. So my thing is how do we approach that as well when it's such a sensitive topic for their age group?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Can I ask how old the child is?
She is 10.
He's 10.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, I don't talk a lot about working with kids. I think it's a great topic. I don't talk a lot about working with kids, but I know that there are resources out there for for kids, particularly teenagers. There might even be some for kind of prepubescent kids on how to how to start to have a relationship with your body in a way that feels good. Um, so uh, I don't have a lot about working with kids in this particular training, but I would say um, as I go through the manifestations of queer sexuality, I would say let's see if we can maybe work backwards and see how you could have a conversation about um, one's body and the sexual connection to the body with someone who's 10 years old. A,
I feel like
a conversation
I
that's
feel like the
appropriate.
thing that they, because they considered themselves non-binary, they struggled with the most was acceptance of being able to feel that way and to feel like they were being accepted mainly by their parents, not necessarily society on a whole.
Mm, hmm. Okay, okay. So it sounds like for that it's about their their experience of gender in the world is
Correct.
really where they're at right now. Maybe much more so than their sexuality.
Correct. Yeah, I would say
Yeah.
that that's the
Okay.
case.
Okay. So I'll tell you what, when we get to the next section, which is about gender exploration and gender transition, that actually may be more informative for you. So we'll get there. We're going to talk about sexuality. This section's focused on sexuality, but the next piece I
Okay.
think is going to be sexual exploration, and it's going to be gender transition and helping clients through that. And I think it focuses on adults. I have a little piece in there about kids, but I think you may find a lot of that relevant to this non-binary child.
All right. Thank you for your help.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And we have two other questions. One's from Travis. Do you have any resources or tips for transgender clients keeping themselves safe, but also being able to be authentic when dating, especially online dating?
Yeah, I will talk about that in the next section as well, the transgender piece. Yeah, I'm going to talk about social transition, and a part of that is about navigating the world as a transgender person or as a different gender.
Okay. And I had a hand raised. It was Aster. I believe you can feel free to unmute yourself if you still have your question.
It was mostly it already covered that it was non-binary as a non-binary person that it's was gender, not sexuality. And but Aaron covered that. So I'm glad that's coming up next.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
Thank
for
you.
sure, for sure. Yeah, I hope that question gets answered in that section. So manifestations of queer sexuality. So I'm going to talk about these one by one, but these actually oftentimes intersect. So I'm kind of doing this kind of breakdown in a way, but you're going to find that there's lots of intersections. So I'm going to talk about male to male sexuality. In the past, I've called it gay male sexuality, but male to male sexuality can happen, between cisgender and transgender men, and it can happen between gay men and bisexual men or pansexual men, and so forth. So I'm going to talk about male to male sexuality, female to female sexuality, trans and gender nonconforming sexuality, kink and BDSM, consensual non-monogamy, and variations of asexuality. So let's start with male to male sex. And as I talk about this, there's going to be many of you out there who already know this. So, feel free to tune out, go get a snack. That's fine. Or if you want to add something to the chat, or if you want to chime in and you feel like, oh, there's something else, something I'm missing that's not on here, feel free. So again, this is to give you a sense of what sex looks like. So when clients bring it up with us, we start to kind of develop the sense of comfort level and the language to sit with the client around this. I also actually think it's been my experience, and other people have told me, that exposure to different types of sex is actually very helpful. And I'll talk about, watching ethical porn. There's also a film festival that I'll recommend that shows porn for the purpose of normalizing sexuality and showing sexuality in all of its forms. So I'm going to talk about it, but I think actually watching it will actually kind of deepen your own experience. So male to male sex, some of you may already have heard about topping and bottoming when it comes to male sex. So that refers to anal intercourse. The person who is the insertive anal partner is often referred to as the top, and then the verb is topping, and then the receptive anal partner is the bottom, and the verb is bottoming. Some guys, especially in the gay community, may identify as a total top or a total bottom. And other guys may be what's called versatile or verse. So they kind of switch and do both. There is a newly emerging kind of identity in the gay community over the last few years, and of people who identify as sides. So a side is a gay man who doesn't necessarily like anal sex, isn't turned on by it, or doesn't particularly pursue anal sex. They much prefer other sexual activities, other ways of having sex other than anal sex. And this is, again, it's becoming much more prominent now. Sides we'll talk about kind of being invisible in the gay community. And there's also been a lot of kind of side shame. There's been a lot of homonormativity around, like, if you're gay, you should like anal sex. And this is really turning around. And we're hearing more about gay sides. Sometimes if gay men, talk about not being into anal sex, being anxious into anal sex, I have actually asked them, is that something you really want? Is that something that really turns you on, that you really desire? It may be that the answer is no, that it's truly that they're just not into it. Also, oral sex is a very common way of having sex, called sucking. Many people call them blowjobs. Even straight people call it blowjobs. There's what's called analingus, but the slang, very common term for that is rimming, which is oral stimulation, usually with the tongue of the anus. And by the way, the anal sexual activity is most often prefaced with cleaning, right? That's a part of having sex is hygiene. So that's something that gay men learn early on, or men who have sex with men learn early on when having sex is proper hygiene. There's also frottage, and the slang term for that is frotting. That's just when the men rub their two bodies together. So, if they're turned on, they'll rub their penises against each other's bodies, and may even do so up until orgasm. That's another common way of having that men have sex. And as you might imagine, it's a very safe way of having sex. There's also another safe way of having sex is mutual masturbation, also called baiting. So that's when men will masturbate each other, we call it jerking each other off, or they will masturbate themselves with each other. Along with that, there's something called edging that it's fairly common or very commonly heard about in the gay community. It's when someone gives someone a hand job, masturbates them, and kind of postpones the orgasm. So it keeps them on edge. There's also kind of digital stimulation. So fingering the anus or fisting, which fisting could even also be its own category because that is often happens in the world of BDSM. So it's a kind of a more extreme form of sex, often considered more extreme, but it's another way of using the hand for anal stimulation. So anal stimulation is usually pleasurable because it stimulates the prostate, and there are also nerve endings in the anus. So that's why anal stimulation is such a big deal. It feels so good. And also sex toy stimulation might also happen during male-to-male sex or or no, what happens before sex? The word escapes me. So, but sex toy stimulation, such as use of dildos, butt plugs, in particular, those two things. Foreplay, that's the word I was thinking of. Sorry, morning brain fart. So. There's also a sex culture within the gay community, within the MSM, what's called MSM community, men who have sex with men. And so these are some things that you might hear about that men who have sex with men might talk to you about, might want to bring up in therapy. Monogamish couples and open relationships. It's very common for gay men to at least experiment with opening up their relationship, maybe just at least once. There are many gay men who are monogamous, but I have found it fairly common for gay men to open their relationships, either to experiment with it, or it's a common thing and it's open for much, if not all, their entire relationships. And that can look many different ways. They can have a lot of different kinds of agreements with each other around their open relationship. Sometimes they bring other people in with them. Other times they go out on their own and have sex, and sometimes they want to hear about it, sometimes they don't. So all sorts of agreements can be made. And that may be something that's worked out in the therapy. What do you want this to look like? Friends with benefits. Not uncommon among gay men, especially in that phase 4 to 5 part of identity development, when people are wanting to explore their sexuality. So friends with benefits just basically means it's a friend that you have sex with, someone and someone you trust usually, and it's someone you get together with for sex, but it's nothing more. You're not dating or having a relationship. Also casual hookups, anonymous sex. There are places to do that. Of course, the apps that I've talked about in the past, like Grindr, that's the most common one, but there are lots of others. There are bathhouses, there are sex clubs. Bathhouses and sex clubs are less common than they used to be because of the digital age, but they still exist. You may also hear about chemsex. That is a fairly recent word that I'm hearing, but some variation of that has been common in the gay male community for a long time. And chemsex just means kind of using drugs with sex. I talked about that in my last training. I gave an example of it. So it's when gay men may use things like cocaine, stimulants, cocaine, meth, sometimes psychedelics like MDMA. There's also the use of poppers, which is kind of like it's a chemical like nail polish remover, but it kind of creates a temporary high, and it's also a poppers are also vasodilators, so they kind of help to open up the anus to make it looser for penetration. So so different ways that drugs can be integrated into sex. So that may be brought up in the therapy room. It's one of those things where the clients may bring it up to see how you react or how you respond. And I will say, sometimes when we talk about casual hookups, when we talk about sex, when we talk about orgies, sex parties, when we talk about drugs, sometimes it's a problem and sometimes it's not. So this is when you kind of assess, what does it mean for the client? When you take a closer look and you talk to them about it, it may be something that's purely recreational for them. And, they're just having their late stage adolescence, having fun, right? And for others, it is perhaps becoming a problem, and they do need an intervention. So circuit parties are really big. These are big parties that happen sometimes, weekend-long parties, where there's a lot of dancing, a lot of house music, things like that, EDM, and then there's a lot of sex and drugs. They're big party weekends, and very common among gay men between, I would say, the age of 20s, 30s, 40s. Again, many are in that kind of phase 4 to 5, kind of living the young life that they didn't get to live. And then there's sexual tribes. These are the ones listed here are from Grindr, but these are pretty common. So a tribe, so to speak, it just references the kind of group that one may have a sexual attraction to. So there's a leather tribe, so to speak, right? Where men are into leather, and men are into other men who are into leather, and that's what turns them on. Then there's daddies, like younger guys who are into older guys. And then also twinks, which is a young guy. So there may be guys who are into what's called twinks, usually a young guy, 30 or under. Discreet people, usually people who are married or are out, but they're kind of getting together in secret. Jocks, of course, people who are athletic. Bears are a community of guys who are often on the larger size, on the larger plus size side, and otters are hairy guys, not necessarily larger, but like hairy. Sometimes bears and otters are attracted to each other, but there's like the whole community there. So again, just this is likely to be brought up if you have a client who is a gay male and they want to be comfortable talking about their life with you. They're going to bring this stuff up. So it's just important to know about it and also see how they bring it up to you. Is it just a part of their life, just a part of their existence? Or are they indicating to you somehow that a piece of this has become problematic for them? Either way, it calls on us to be completely non-judgmental, right? And ethically curious. So next is female to female sex. And I'll say here what I said in the last training when I talk about sex, that among groups and populations of which I'm not a part. So I am not a female. I am not trans or non-binary. So when I'm talking about sex among these communities, I'm talking from a place of my own experience as a therapist, talking with clients, and doing my own research. So I am not a representative of these communities. So if anyone is a representative of these communities and you want to add something, I welcome that. So female to female sex is often, it can be digital masturbation, so fingering or fisting the vaginal canal. Oral sex, which can be cunnilingus or analingus. Tribadism, also called tribbing, and that's a practice where the vulva is rubbed up against a part of the partner's body. And scissoring is kind of like another kind of tribbing where two vulva, like the legs get intertwined and the vulvas get rubbed together for sexual stimulation. And that's also been called frottage, just kind of like what men do. But most lesbians, from what I hear, call it tribbing. And then there's also sex toy stimulation, use of things like dildos and vibrators. And sex toys are used in the context of sexual connection. I mentioned before, as it says here, dildos are not a substitute for a penis or a male part. I really want to emphasize that. It's used as in the context of wanting to connect with one's partner. This is a slide from my previous training, so some of this is just reminder. According to research, 70% of focus is on oral genital sex as a large component of sexual stimulation for lesbians and bisexual women who have sex with women. A lot of other variety of ways of having sex that are kind of often folded in to the totality of the sexual experience: hugging, licking, snuggling, kissing all over the body, breast stimulation, digital masturbation. It's often said that more time is spent on sexual behaviors that are considered foreplay to most people. So as I said, sex is not just intercourse. Sex is really, it's just being in the sexual response cycle. And that is particularly true for female to female sex. I spoke briefly on lesbian bed death in my last training. It can be brought up, in individual therapy. I've had it brought up in the context of couples therapy as well. And I would hold that lightly. The idea of lesbian bed death, it's a myth kind of within the lesbian community. And it really comes down to what the client's experience is. I have heard clients talk about experiencing lesbian bed death. It's this idea that once a relationship is established, the sex just kind of stops with lesbian women, maybe after a year or two. And part of the assessment there is how much of a problem is that for the clients. For some lesbian clients, that may not be a problem at all. And different studies show different things. Like some studies show that lesbians do have less sex than, say, heterosexual folks, and other studies show that they don't have any less sex. So it really comes down to the client's experience if they bring it up to you. In one report, I thought I'd put this quote in here. I thought I'd put this quote in here because it kind of captures qualitatively what female to female sex is. This research participant in a female sexuality study wrote, "Sex with a woman includes touching, kissing, smiling, looking serious, embracing, talking, digital intercourse, caressing, looking, cunnilingus, undressing, remembering later, making sounds, sometimes gently biting, sometimes crying, and breathing and sighing together." So there you go. All right, so queer and trans sexuality. This is a slide from my previous training. I'll just kind of do an overview, and then I'll kind of get more specific. I talked about how a lot of queer and trans sexuality is about rewriting and degendering language to describe body parts, and to just generally describe the narrative of the body, the embodied experience. Sexual pleasure in the body for a trans or non-binary person often does not look the same way as it's depicted in mainstream society. I think trans people, in my experience, trans people in particular, have experienced this dominant narrative of sexuality being imposed on their body. So there is a sort of decolonizing practice that needs to happen for our trans and non-binary folks around the body, of kind of building their own erotic story around their body. So also note, sexuality can trigger body dysphoria. There are also the effects of hormones on sexuality. I talked last time about how estrogen and anti-androgens often lead to a decreased sex drive, while testosterone leads to an increased sex drive. And hormones can also lead to changing sexual orientations. Someone who was not attracted to men before T might start to become attracted to men, and vice versa. And trans women may become curious about men, whereas they weren't before. And of course, surgery can affect sexual response, but that's all a part of the landscape of rewriting the narrative of the body. Lucy Fielding, in her book, talks about mystification as something trans and non-binary folks go through in kind of reclaiming their sexuality. And I'm just going to read from her because I think she says it really well. Mystification is essentially a decolonizing mode of operation, one designed to throw off totalizing hegemonic discourses designed almost exclusively for cis-het folks, that means cisgender heterosexual folks, that demand that trans folks blend or pass as well as extrapolate their sexualities and their desires from cis folks. We can then help our clients tap into intergenerational wisdom in trans and queer communities and evoke the individual client's capacities for ingenuity and invention. The goal is to help create a space that allows the clients to unlock and awaken new pathways for erotic expression, pleasure, and embodied joy. I think that's a really beautiful quote. And I think queer people in general have to go through some sort of process like this of having to become inventive in order to break free from these dominant narratives of what is normal sexuality and what our body is supposed to do. So really the menus that I have given you around male to male sexuality and female to female sexuality really speak to this ingenuity of what sex can be. And trans and non-binary folks, I think, are called on to do this even to a greater degree. So they're called on to this mystification process, to this also what Fielding calls coming into passionate relationship with the self, discovering their body as it's true for them, as they know it to be. So, mystification and discovery, I think that's another important word. Mystification and discovery of, one's erotic embodiment kind of comes in these different steps. Lucy Fielding talks about a piece of that process being revisioning. She specifically talks about embodied revisioning. So discovering and imagining the sexual story of the body, right? And in the client's case, you say your body, and we might even talk about that. We might even start that dialogue about how can you create a narrative, a living embodied narrative of you that is not about what other people have told you it is, but what is your embodied story? And a part of that is remapping erogenous zones. Like we're taught like what our erogenous zones are, right? The erogenous zones are the genitals, It's when the penis gets hard and the vagina gets wet and the nipples get stimulated, right? But we have so many more erogenous zones on our body that we don't think about. And cis people don't really have to think about that. But trans people are called on to think about that in a larger way. So just being with the body and discovering, in her book, she even does a hand exercise where she says, just be with your hand and look, just feel into it and notice where it feels good. So connecting with all the different parts of your body and noticing what feels good. And another piece, and I'll get into this later, is, turning to role models, watching porn, ethical porn, and seeing what gets other people off, what turns other people on, what turns other trans and non-binary people on. So you connect with the fullness of the body. So remapping erogenous zones, right? Beyond just the genitals. The other part is renaming body parts. How we name body parts is a part of this dominant cultural discourse, right? And body parts have come to be kind of gendered. For example, we think of a penis as male and masculine, right? We think of breasts as feminine. So that kind of discourse, and we might even call it a sort of colonization of the body, may not match a trans person's sense of their own body parts. So renaming body parts is a big thing, can often be a big thing for trans people. And I will say other queer people do this as well. I've seen gay men do this kind of renaming body parts. So this is a beautiful quote from Trans Bodies, Trans Selves, which kind of like qualitatively lays out this process. One way many of us show our bodies love is by rewriting the language we use to describe them. Many of us have body parts that feel gendered in ways that do not match our sense of self. This can make it difficult for some of us to hear those body parts called by standard names. Many of us create our own names for our body parts. For example, some of us born with a vagina may prefer to call it a front hole because the term is less gendered. So the term front hole is very, very common because it's neutral, it's gender neutral. Some of us create new words that are just ours so that we share with our sexual partners. So others may use terms such as cock, clitoris, or vagina to refer to other parts of our bodies that we use or think about in these ways. For example, some of us who do not have a front hole may call our anus our vagina. Okay? So this is part of the process for many folks. And if we're talking about sex, yeah, you might ask, what do you call that part of your body? Right? Don't make assumptions. This is kind of a breakdown that Fielding did of some commonly utilized terms that trans and gender nonconforming folks use for certain parts of the body. It's just to give you an idea. Okay.
Aaron, we have a few questions in the chat. I don't know if you wanted to go on a mini break first before you get to them. What would you like?
Yeah. So let me finish this piece real quick, and then I'll answer questions, and we'll take break.
Okay, perfect.
So what does trans and gender nonconforming sex look like? First, all of the above. Everything I mentioned, about male sex, female sex, it can include any of that. Anal, oral, vaginal, masturbation, mutual masturbation, sex toy stimulation, frottage, use of erogenous zones all over the body. You decenter the genital experience, right? And for trans women, there's a common practice called muffing, which is the use of the inguinal canal, which is the canal behind the scrotum from where the testicles hang. So I'll talk later about tucking, which is something trans women do. Drag queens also do it, where they push the testicles up into the body cavity, which is called the inguinal canal. This can also be used. This part of the body can also be used sexually, and can be fingered. So people can push their testicles up and finger the canal to get the sense of penetration. And it also feels good because there's nerve endings in the inguinal canal. So that is a common practice among trans women, trans feminine folks. Other folks may do it as well, may get off on it, but it is common among trans feminine folks. So, all right, so talked a little bit about that. And next, we'll talk about kink and BDSM, but first some questions, and then we'll take a brief break. Questions?
Alrighty. So we have, can you please describe what a twink is again?
Yes, a twink it's a colloquial term, it's slang in the gay community for a younger man. Usually it's someone under age 30. So If someone says they're into twinks, it means they're into young guys or young looking guys.
Also, do you consider polyamory, polygamy, polyandry under the open relationship category?
It can be. It can fall into, oh, but not necessarily. I'm going to talk about consensual non-monogamy in just a bit. And so hopefully you'll get more clarity about that. Polyamory can be non-monogamous, but well, polyamory actually technically is not monogamous. We'll say that, right? Because you're having sex, you have more than one partner. But it's possible for a poly unit to be exclusive with each other. I'll talk more about that.
Okay. And is there more about how medications like SSRIs can impact drive and desire?
Well, they definitely can. Yeah. And that's, that's a kind of a sexual functioning issue, which is kind of a different topic. But yeah, if clients are on SSRIs, absolutely, those cause sexual side effects. So it's possible a client may talk to you about, yeah, I can't have sex, and I'm noticing, and we may assess, are you on any SSIs? That may be a side effect. If you're having trouble, like either connecting to your desire or having an erection, getting aroused, things like that. Yeah. So you might direct them to talk to their psychiatrist about changing medications.
Okay. And we have an insert from Christina. I've lived in Ohio and Michigan area. Exploration is more open than it is on the Eastern Shore. Where they currently live, I'm sorry, I'm trying to paraphrase. They're being exposed to where she lives. They're more closed-minded, so they're being exposed to different lifestyles through friends. Pretty much, how would she go by holding a smart meeting with people on both sides? So someone who's totally against anything other than heterosexual sex and lifestyles.
Is this for clinicians or just like community members? That's my first question.
Christina, please unmute yourself so we can dive in more. um, Christina? Okay. And
Also,
Kelly, oh, I'm
have to
sorry.
come back after break and we can.
Okay. And Kelly, yours is also rather long. Can you please unmute yourself to share?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically I was just saying in and asking a question, Aaron, that isn't really at all meant to throw any kind of shade at all, right? So, but as a queer therapist, sometimes other clinicians or friends or whatever will ask me questions about their clients that happen to be in the community that they're working with. They're a little concerning to me, right? So my question for you is, um, and these are well-meaning clinicians who I truly believe are really seeking information and resources. But do you have any idea of like what is the baseline knowledge that you think a therapist needs to have in order to not cause harm to this community? Like, how can we give guidance to clinicians who are just starting to dive into queer theory and the queer community and working with this population so that we can say, listen, in order for you to work with this population safely, you need to kind of have this level of understanding, or you need to be comfortable with these and knowledgeable in these areas. Is there any baseline that we could give folks for scope of practice?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, yeah, my hope is that part of this training provides some of this baseline. And I don't know if there's any studies that have been done that offer a sense of that. Like what is the minimum amount of training one has to have in order to work with this population with competency and for this population to feel safe with them. So I'm actually curious about like what the kinds of questions that come up. that are some of the things that you hear. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. One, like recently, there was just sort of a general discussion around, oh, if you have a trans youth, client, that are we going to write a letter for their medication or not? And I thought, wow, there's like 8,000 questions that come before that, right? So, and
uh,
it's more about, right, that
yeah,
also our clinicians are being thrown into a world, for lack of a better term, where even, let's take that trans youth client that's coming, the parents' level of understanding about what that child is going to be going through if they do start some kind of medication management. What does it look like the gatekeeping
yeah,
of, right?
yeah.
So it's just,
Hmm.
that's just one example of many
Hmm.
that I experience, really on a weekly basis. It can be sometimes, or at least on a monthly basis. And again, it isn't at all because people are willfully, ill meaning, right? It's just,
Right.
and I'm
You just
thinking
don't
like,
know.
I'm a little lost because I'm like, wow, there's so much that it would take me days to get this person caught up with what they need to know.
Absolutely. Yes, yes. And trans children that is a that I think that is a very like particular subject that I'll admit falls way out of scope of from this training, but and I was going to say later on, if you plan to work with trans kids, that you need specialized training for that, for sure. So uh, and I would say even if you plan on working with trans clients and being a gender specialist, if you want to claim to work with trans clients, um, you need specific training around it, and I will offer that later. I would also say that it's hard to say what the baseline is. I think that um, what I try to do with this training is to provide people with enough of a foundation to start to provide a safe relationship with the clients. But I still recommend that if you work with the queer community and you're not and you're still building a familiarity with it, to keep getting training and consultation. So if you have a queer person or more queer people in your practice, get consultation around it. Continue to build your knowledge, and continue to take classes. Later in this training, even with around sexuality, I will give you more resources so that you can continue building your knowledge around sexuality. So this class, what I hope with this training is that it provides you all some sense of traction in terms of the internal attitudes you hold, understanding your assumptions and your biases, and cultivating a spirit of openness and that ethical curiosity, and having some knowledge base of sexuality so that you can talk to clients, and also to have this spirit of continued learning. If you're just starting out working with the queer community, um, I just really have to say, just continue getting consultation and training. Um, but it's really hard to say what a solid baseline is for working with this community. I mean, I work with this community and I still have to get training, you know?
Yeah, I agree with that. Thank you so much. That's actually really helpful to just remember to encourage people to go ahead and get training and to, you know, and to just expand, try first with themselves, right? With the expansion
Yes.
and also, and I just want to say too that like one thing that that the cishet community is just so used to, and the dominant culture is so used to pathologizing this, that one of the things that I think is also helpful that I've is just reminding clinicians and also clients alike that you're allowed to play and be curious, and that this is actually glorious, right? Like, this is not something that and I want clinicians to just be at ease with themselves and be at ease with what you don't know. Like you just said, there's so much that I don't know. And I'm a member of the community, right? And I'm always trying to keep up. So, but right, it's just this, let's lessen the tension and just really explore and
Yes.
play and have fun.
I could not agree with you more. That's it. Yes. Yeah. And a lot of it is internal work, frankly. This is for everyone. if I think, personally for me, and this would be the hope for everyone, that as we, as you explore all of the different ways of being a sexual being, through queer sexuality, that it can teach us to unlock aliveness in ourselves. And if we can cultivate that sense of erotic aliveness within ourselves and own those parts of ourselves, then that's actually a lot of the work. We bring that openness to our clients, right? If we can be non-judgmental and openness with ourselves about our own desires and the energy that lives inside of us, then we inevitably bring that to the client, right? That sense of curiosity. I often say queering your practice will just make you a better clinician in general. And it will make you better at working with non-queer clients. Because of the work that I've done with gay men, queer men, trans folks, I'm able to work with straight men on a deeper level around their sexuality and their romantic identity and their gender presentation. It just opens us up in a different way. So a lot of the work is, with ourselves and being in that space of creativity and play, which I'm going to talk about with kink and BDSM. Perfect segue. Thank you, Kelly. So next section, kink and BDSM. It's another, what I call, manifestation of queer sexuality that you might hear about with queer clients. Kink and BDSM is not just a queer thing. Straight non-queer clients do it as well, but queer clients are, I think, more likely to explore kink and BDSM because they've already started on the process of challenging these dominant constructs of normality, right, around sexuality. And so they just kind of start, creatively, building the kind of sex life that they want for themselves. And there's a place for it in the queer community. And as I mentioned before, even some people who are not queer, who practice BDSM and kink, may feel more at home in the queer community. So just to clarify what the terms are, we're going to kind of break down what kink and BDSM is, kind of what it looks like, what are some common terms, and then we'll get into kind of the deeper meaning behind it, like, what function does it serve for people? And, how might you approach it as a therapist in dialogue with your client? So first, what is kink? So kink can basically be described as non-traditional types of sexual experiences and activity. It's often the focus of what invigorates one erotically. Another way I put it is a kind of a non-traditional experience that turns one on. So like getting spanked, right? Doing some kind of role play, being tickled, right, is a kink. And then BDSM is a type of kink. And it's a kink that focuses on power exchange. The acronym stands for bondage, domination/discipline, submission/sadism, masochism. So it all implies that there is this power exchange and kind of an established power dynamic that is consensual. It is agreed upon. I will reemphasize that later, between sexual partners. And it often involves one person being in control and the other person being restrained in some way. That's either physical restraint or it's, a sort of implied psychological restraint, right? Telling them what to do, where they can go, and all of that. And then oftentimes there are fetishes the use of fetishes are involved, the integration of fetishes are involved in BDSM and kink. And so a fetish is a sexual arousal from a particular object or body part other than sexual organs. So it could be feet and armpits are common body parts, right, that people have fetishes for. But it's not always an aspect of kink and BDSM, but it very often is. So here's some types of kink you might hear about that clients might talk about. Pretty common. One is impact play. So impact is when you like to feel the impact of something on the body, right? There's often some kind of friction, physical friction one is experiencing. So some examples are laid out there: getting spanked, restraint, being bitten. Although the biting doesn't have to, it's not hard biting, right? But it's some kind of impact, right? Doesn't cause damage oftentimes. Whipping in more extreme cases. Lots of different types. The list could go on. Another type of kink can be group sex, right? Getting together with a group of people and having sex. Role playing, all kinds of role playing, right? I just have a little brief list there, right? Sometimes you play animal owner. There's a prisoner or a guard, doctor, nurse, like medical kind of role play kink. What's called age play, where one person's really young, one person's an adult. People and non-human creatures. I've heard of people like playing superheroes and villains, things like that. And then there's sensation play. So that's when you play with the senses, all the senses. So it could be like getting tickled, hot wax, water sports, which could include some kind of liquids being poured on you. Sometimes there's what's called piss play, where people get peed on, being blindfolded, not being able to see, anything where the senses are blocked or stimulated. Sometimes it could be, smells. Voyeurism, which of course is watching, some people just like to watch and maybe masturbate. That's a type of kink. And also exhibitionism, like being watched, being naked, being watched having sex, being watched while being in a vulnerable position. So BDSM, like I said, is a type of kink, right? It's kind of a prevalent type of kink. And then within the BDSM realm, there are specific types of play that you'll hear about. Okay, so this is in the context of that kind of power exchange where there's usually a dominant and a submissive, or sometimes there can be multiple dominants and a submissive, right? But there's that dynamic is at play. So you may hear about shibari, which is a type of rope and knot play. When I was in San Francisco, I remember there was a place that taught BDM classes, and they would teach knot classes, like how to tie knots. So people are really into it. There's also pain play. So spanking, biting, but harder, right? Scratching, whipping, paddling. So in BDSM, sometimes the impact play can cross over into pain play, where pain is actually felt on the body. There's also often the experience of humiliation of some sort in a BDSM play scenario. So the dominant person may insult the person, call them names, and also degrade the partner, right? So you may restrain them, make them do different things. Lick my boot, lick my feet. May pee on them. Even kind of whipping or paddling someone is a form of humiliation. There's all sorts of ways that can happen. You might also hear about a lifestyle or 24/7 BDSM. So that's a scenario where the dom or the dominant has control over the sub or the submissive on a regular basis. So there's regular forms of address. So the submissive is to call the dominant by a certain name, like sir would be a common one. Or I've heard pap, someone might call their doms pap, and he calls the submissive sub. So they have ways of addressing each other even outside of the place where sex happens, but it's kind of a 24/7 thing. And then there are rules that have to be followed. Sometimes there are segments of this in the gay male community where the submissive wears a chain, as a sort of ownership, like his dom, or sometimes they call him his master, owns him, and then he has to call his dom, for permission to do certain things. So there's all sorts of different ways that can be arranged. And then kind of on the bottom, on the outskirts, I included edge play, also called RAC, which is risk-aware consensual kink. That is a very extreme form of BDSM and oftentimes very realistic. And it, can cause actual injury. So it can include things with like knives. It can include like, actually injuring someone, whipping, paddling someone, to the point of real injury. Include needles, things like that. I think it's outside of the scope of what we're talking about, and people who are into edge play are very likely going to want to seek out someone who specializes in BDSM. And there are plenty of therapists who specialize in working with the BDSM community. But I would say if you don't know this community, you're very unlikely to see someone who is into edge play. But you might hear about some of this other stuff. Common fetishes that you'll hear about associated with BDSM, leather, that's a big one. I already talked about the leather community. There's a big leather community, especially in the gay male community. There's leather conferences. There's latex is a fetish, also rubber, chains, wearing chains, metal, things like that. And I also mentioned in terms of the body, armpits and feet are very common fetishes. So fetishes are a turn on for people. It's part of the erotic experience because they are associated with the entirety of the kink or BDSM experience, right? So when I smell leather and I feel leather, I think of being restrained, right? It's all kind of woven into the whole experience. All right. So I've kind of laid out kind of what kink is on the surface and what you can expect to hear about. I want to take a slightly deeper dive because there is a way that we hold this practice with clients, and a way we talk about it. If you're not familiar with kink and BDSM, you've never done it, or you're just now hearing about it, on a surface level, it can seem disturbing, or what I say on a literal level, it can feel disturbing or hard to connect with at the least. So I think it's important to actually see it from a non-literal perspective and to see it from a depth perspective. And I have found the best way to approach kink and BDSM is from a depth psychology perspective. Depth psychology is, has its, really has its start with Carl Jung and his origins of transpersonal psychology and the creativity that stems from that and the healing force of creativity that stems from it. There's another book I can recommend by Doug Thomas. It's called The Deep Psychology of Kink and BDSM, or The Deep Psychology of BDSM and Kink. And he writes in that book, according to Carl Jung, sexuality is a life-affirming instinctual energy that can stimulate the individuation process. So Carl Jung was saying that sexuality, it was a part of our creative force. And when we use it creatively, it can actually connect us more with ourselves, connect us more with the fullness of ourselves. So Douglas wrote, BDSM presents an opportunity for individuals to reclaim discarded parts of the inner life that are countercultural in nature, yet psychologically necessary for them to gain self-knowledge and move towards becoming a whole person. In the Jungian perspective, wholeness is a greater mandate than goodness. I think that's a really important concept to hold when we're talking about the kink and BDSM play space, right? Because for the participants, It is a form of play that is lead in it at its best and its most effective, is leading to a deeper connection with the self and a greater sense of wholeness. Excuse me. So Carl Jung said that this movement towards wholeness is actually more important than being a good person, because when we try to be good, then we actually discard parts of ourself. We fragment, right? And that actually leads to society being fragmented, right? And we project our shadow out there. Carl Jung was influenced by witnessing the Nazi occupation of Germany, right? And how, you know, the notion of being a good or ideal person actually turned into othering people, right? The disowning of parts of ourselves leads us to othering others. I think of the prison industrial complex personally. You know, if I see myself as a good person and I don't own the shadow parts, the parts that are bad, then I can just project outwards and say those are the bad people, right? We can all do that, and we can just lock them away, right? And really, society is not any better for it. We're worse off for it. This was Carl Jung's whole idea, right? That the more we own the fullness of our being, the more we deepen into that, the more harmony, right? It starts to exist within us and outside of us. So we start with that premise with kink and BDSM. And depth psychology, there are certain depth psychology stemming from Jung's idea here of wholeness. There are depth psychology concepts that are very related to kink and BDSM and the kink and BDSM play space. And those are shadow integration, which I just mentioned, right? It is claiming parts of ourselves that we are scared of, that we hate, that we don't want to own. And we go into that and we start to become more integrated over time. Another piece of it is archetypal experiencing. We actually experience shadow integration through archetypal experiencing. An archetype is a symbolic representation of an energy that exists within us, right? So, villain, right? Hero, wizard, right? You name it. The sidekick. You look to the big movies like, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, the superhero movies. Those are all archetypes. We're just projecting them outward and seeing ourselves in them. And then also part of it is imagination, fantasy, and play. Kelly talked about this, mentioned this. Play and fun is a part of that. Going into a play space where we experience these archetypes within us, play them out, and then integrate the shadow. And that all happens in the realm of soul or psyche. The soul is the totality of our consciousness, the totality of our being that always exists. And that ultimately, when we move towards wholeness, we get more connected to the soul. Okay. And so this is what happens in the BDSM play space. It's what happens in any play space. It's what happens in any creative modality, especially in the therapy space. But this can only happen in a safe space. So there must be boundaries of safety for which this process can happen. And so that happens through the cornerstones of BDSM and kink. And those are listed there. Negotiation. There must be negotiation between partners ahead of time about what is going to happen. What are you looking for? What do all parties want from this? 2, consent. It must be consensual from all parties. If it is not consensual, it is not kind of a bona fide BDSM experience, right? There must be safe words, because when you go into the BDSM play space, you could have a scenario where you're being held captive. Maybe it's a rape scenario, and the typical words like stop and no aren't, that's part of the fantasy. So you have to have safe words to say to the other person, I've reached my limit. We have to stop. You have agreed safe words. Next is containment. There must be containment through locality and duration. What is the space that we're going to do this in? And what is the period of time? It's going to take place from this time to this time. Just like in therapy, right? We create that safety. And then aftercare. There's going to be oftentimes some kind of connection that happens between the partners afterwards. Some cuddling, right? Some soothing, some comfort in some way. And then debriefing. The partners will talk about, how was that for you? Were there any lines that were crossed? How can we do it better next time? So you're building safety, you're building a safe relationship. If these things aren't in place, then it's important to go back and kind of review and hone these cornerstones. So Douglas Thomas also wrote, I really like this quote, if a child immersed in play with a set of dolls can have a healing emotional experience, it follows that kinksters playing inside a modern dungeon also could. So it is really about play, and it's about the healing and expansion that comes through play. When we as therapists, if you've ever worked with kids, or if you've heard about working with kids, you know that you don't do any talking with kids. A lot of it is play. You bring out the puppets, you work in the sand tray, you bring out the toys, and you create a scene. And you process with the child by doing a scene. And you set up villains, you set up bad guys, you set up kids. There's violence that happens. People shoot people down. There's no talking, but oftentimes we know that there's a transformation that occurs through that process. I had the same experience when I worked with teenagers. I did, I did an improv group. I did a filmmaking group with teenagers. We set up scenes where we have the containment, right? And once we have the containment, the safety, we could do anything in the imagination. These kids are killing people. Yeah, they're doing all sorts of stuff, but it's all in the imagination. It's play. And there's no talking about it. There's the assumption that transformation happens through the play. So this is a big part of kink and BDSM. Douglas wrote, the notion of what play is changes from its being an activity to being a process. Play as recreation or entertainment changes as a way of relating that leads to a deeper understanding of self and a fuller experience of being part of the world. When we imagine play as a process of relating, one sees how play can lead to a multidimensional experience of other. The individual experience is a personal transformation that comes from encountering the otherness of the imaginal space. And that's where the shadow integration happens. And he writes that there's 3 different manifestations in which people experience the other in a BDSM space. But this could be in any play space, really. This is all about integration. First, you need the physical presence of a play partner that represents another. And then there's also within oneself the personal shadow, right, that you're needing to integrate. And then there's the archetypal figures in the imaginary space. So who is the play partner or partners representing to you? So here's like an example. Carolyn Shabazz, who is a BDSM scholar, said, when I think of people who are intelligent people who choose to be submissive, part of what they are seeking is the reassurance and stability that comes from living in structured boundaries. That is what authority creates. If you're in a constant soup of autonomy, every single decision has to be renegotiated, reprosecuted every single time, which is extremely taxing on the psyche because we're living in a constant stream of unpredictability and chaos. It's very common for people who are in dominant positions in their everyday life and who have had to take on those positions, people who have been parentified as children, for example, need the experience of being submissive, desperately need to be in a position where they are just told what to do and they can just let go. and they don't have to take on that burden. They have a space where they don't take on that burden anymore. That's one example of how it can work. And then we also can bring in the piece of suffering and degradation, which is an important part of BDSM. And it's important to distinguish the literalism of it versus the non-literalism, right? So, making sure that this happens in an imaginative space and it doesn't leak out into real life. So the ideas of being in non-literal suffering, as Thomas called it, is that first, our fantasies already exist. We don't make them up, right? This is according to Jung and depth psychology. Our fantasies are going on all the time. We have all sorts of twisted fantasies happening inside of us, right? All sorts of power struggles. They're there. So if we don't face them and we go along in life, we risk literalizing these fantasies. They risk kind of seeping out. And when we literalize our fantasies, suffering and fragmentation happens in the world and in our lives, right? This is how people get victimized. We victimize ourselves in different ways, and we victimize others. But when we experience them in the imaginal realm, suffering and degradation can be transcendent and lead to integration. So therefore, people can heal from the effects of literalism by re-experiencing them in the imaginal. So this is another piece of it, that people who have experienced trauma can actually, when they go into the imaginal realm and re-experience that trauma imaginally, it can have a healing effect. This can often be the case with religious themes and medical traumas. And this, particularly within the queer community, queer people have been harmed and traumatized religiously and in the realm of medicine. So it's not uncommon for queer people to have BDSM fantasies around these particular themes. Doug Thomas has an example about a client who had a medical trauma and then did a BDSM scene involving medical situation with their partner. And it involved their partner being masked up in gloves, fully being a non-person, which was a part of that person's trauma, and having to go through submitting to this person all over again and relive that experience. And of that experience, the practitioner said, I think for me, it's really about the way that re-experiencing feelings I had during a traumatic event in a safe environment with someone I love and trust it's my way of exploring what those feelings felt like to me, but where I'm safe and have control over the situation. And I think I'm just sort of wired to get a lot of re-experiencing horrible things that have happened to me. It's almost this way of like weathering down the bad, scary feelings to the point where I don't feel bad and scary and overwhelmed anymore, or where they don't feel bad and scary and overwhelming anymore. Where if I feel fear in a genuinely traumatic moment, it causes trauma. But if I feel the exact same kind of fear, but in an erotic sense where I'm safe and have control, it's not scary at all. And it's great and it's healing for me. So hopefully you can kind of get a sense of what the function of BDSM is for folks. Thomas discriminates between good suffering and bad suffering in BDSM. Good suffering happens when it is non-literal and in the imaginal realm. So actually, I would type it almost in parentheses next to good suffering, non-literal, imaginal. Good suffering happens in the imaginal realm, and bad suffering happens when it's literal. So if there's bad suffering happening in a BDSM experience, it means that it has slipped out of the imaginal realm and into the literal realm. Something has happened with the containment somewhere along the way. And so that might be something we kind of talk through with clients. If an experience was bad or overwhelming or re-traumatizing for them, what was missing from that experience for them? So good suffering, what should happen, what we should see from clients, which they should be reporting to us, is that there's an increased sense of maturity. There's emotional healing happening. There is psychic growth. There's a sense of meaning and wholeness. There's a sense of progress towards their destiny, which means they have a sense of where they're going. And there's expansiveness. If there's bad suffering, it usually looks like a trauma response, frankly. Decreased or stagnated maturity, dissociation, psychic numbness, compartmentalization, feeling bad about yourself, or having a sense of restriction. And there is a word of caution about BDSM, because these encounters, especially if they're numinous or have some kind of spiritual link to them, religious link, they can be overwhelming for sure, especially for people who aren't used to it. He writes that the psychic energy of the archetype can have too great of a valence to integrate into the consciousness. It can just be too much to be integrative. And then also identifying with an archetype, whether you're in the dominant role or the submissive role, if you are like a master or you're a slave and you're identifying with it, it can lead to destructive feelings of inferiority or self-loathing on one extreme, or to grandiose self-importance and power on the other. So there is a risk for the imaginal to become literal. So the antidotes to that happening, to that kind of overwhelm and re-traumatization, are as follows. Approach the scenes with respect, humility, and care. Gradually, and I emphasize, and Thomas emphasizes, gradually grow familiar with the depths of transformative suffering. Don't do one big scene at first. Start small with if this is new for someone, start small. A trusting relationship with a play partner. That play partner must be someone you know and trust. Learning from experienced practitioners, support from a kink affirming community. So be a part of a community that can guide you through the process. And of course, follow those cornerstones of BDSM and kink. So that's it for BDSM and kink. So I hope that kind of helps you at least start to navigate this world if you ever have a client who is into BDSM and kink. And it may be a part of their world. They may bring it up to you, but it's not central to their treatment at all. But if they talk about experiences and they start to feel like they slip out of the imaginal and into the non-literal or traumatic, you have an idea of what to visit with them and where to point them to if it goes in that direction. But oftentimes, kink and BDSM, when it's practiced in the right way, has a very healing effect for folks. And maybe some of you already know people in the BDSM and kink community, and I have found them to be pretty well-adjusted people. So next is consensual non-monogamy, another kind of manifestation of queerness. Although, again, non-queer people are non-monogamous as well. So consensual non-monogamy is when all partners mutually and ethically agree to allow romantic and or sexual relationships with others outside of the relationship in some way. And there are many forms that it can take. This is an old slide from my last training, so I'm just bringing it up again, but I'm going to go more in depth with the others. So this slide comes from Jessica Fern, who wrote a book called Polysecure. I mentioned it in a later slide. She has identified kind of different forms non-consensual monogamy can take, and she kind of breaks it down in these quadrants. And I'm going to go through the quadrants one at a time with you, but here's kind of the layout. So clients may come to you having any kind of, form of relationship, that looks like one of these. Some relationships have high sexual exclusivity. Some have low sexual exclusivity. Some have high emotional exclusivity. Some have low emotional exclusivity, and any combination. So let's start with the ones that have high sexual and emotional exclusivity. These are going to be the ones most people are familiar with. There's monogamy. That speaks for itself. Most people know monogamy. two people are committed to each other. Then there's monogamish. Monogamish is fairly common among gay men, I have found. These are couples who are mostly sexual and emotionally exclusive, but periodically they'll have some extra relational sex or sex play. So non-monogamy isn't common with them, but they'll make occasional exceptions. That was a term coined by Dan Savage, who's the popular sex columnist. Then there's polyfidelity, and this came up earlier. Polyfidelity is a romantic or sexual relationship that involves more than two people, but they're exclusive with each other. So a throuple or a triad who are just exclusive with each other they're a polyamorous unit, but there is fidelity there. Or sometimes a quad, what's called a quad, 4 people who are in a relationship together and have negotiated that. All right, and then there's high emotional exclusivity and low sexual exclusivity. So that would include swinging, which is actually a common practice for non-queer people, for straight people, but queer people might engage in it as well. It's when couples just engage in sexual activity with other couples, and usually do it together. And do some kind of exchange. And then there's an open marriage or relationship. So that's when people are they're committed to each other, but they're able to have sexual and romantic partners or connections outside of the relationship. But that's the only relationship that they have. Now, next we have low sexual and emotional exclusivity. So this is when we get into multiple relationships at once. This is a polyamory, the practice of having many loves where, everyone is involved and is aware and is consenting. So polyamory can take many different forms. There's hierarchical polyamory, where there's one, like a primary partnership. And then from that primary partnership, each partner might have different partners. They might have one other partner on the side, like a secondary partner, or they might also have more than one. They might have 2 secondary partners, or secondary and tertiary partner. And then there's non-hierarchical polyamory, where there is not a primary partnership. There's just several different partnerships that happen at once. Now, these kinds of relationships, hierarchical and non-hierarchical polyamory, are sometimes called polycules. Think of molecule. They're polycules. So they're relationships that just branch out into each other. So, these partners each have a partner, and then this partner may have other partners, and then their partners may have other partners. So there's a polycule, and sometimes that forms a sort of polyamorous community. As you might imagine, it is very complex. And so communication that happens with couples needs to be that much stronger in polyamorous situations. There's also something called solo polyamory, which emphasizes personal agency. So in that kind of situation, individuals don't engage in any kind of getting tied up with any aspect of their life with partners. They may have multiple partners, but there's no sense of sharing things domestically or financially. And then on the bottom of the list, which is, it's almost like outside of this, is something called relationship anarchy, which people just work to dismantle social hierarchies altogether and how relationships are prioritized. So it's possible you might have someone who is polyamorous in your practice, and it's important to be kind of versed in that. And I also should mention, there's also high sexual exclusivity and low emotional exclusivity, which happens with either polyintimates. So these are people who might choose to share a home and even children together, but they don't have any romantic intimacy or sexual intimacy, or they might, or it's kind of very limited. Then there's also polyamorous and asexual people. People who identify as polyamorous do not experience sexual attraction to others. These are people who identify as polyamorous but don't experience sexual attraction to others. And they don't engage in sex, but they still might experience romantic attraction to others. So would still experience themselves as polyamorous. And just something to be aware of when it comes to consensual non-monogamy is that there are certain principles of relating that make consensual non-monogamy effective. First is consent. There must be consent from everyone involved. Make sure that that's happening. There are clear agreements also from everyone involved. A lot of times when there is harm that is caused in these kinds of relationships, it's because the agreements weren't clear or someone did not make their desires known or clear enough. There is usually ongoing negotiation that happens so that if something's not working, someone's able to speak up and say, hey, I think something might need to be adjusted here. I'm realizing it's not working for me. If you're going out and seeing this person on Saturday night, for example. And then honest communication of needs and feelings. There needs to be honesty. Again, all of this must be in place for ethical non-monogamy to be happening. And here's some additional resources for consensual non-monogamy. The Ethical Slut is just a classic. I think it's still relevant. So I would recommend it for any therapists who are interested in working with consensual non-monogamy. And it's an easy book to recommend to clients. It's very, it's very for the layperson. Then there's also Polysecure by Jessica Fern, The Therapist's Guide to Consensual Non-Monogamy, and Open Monogamy by Tammy Nelson. Those are all good books to read more about non-monogamy. And finally, if you're going to talk about sex, I'll reemphasize, understand sexually transmitted infections, which is what STI stands for, and safe sex practices. Know about PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis, to prevent HIV infection if people are sexually active. It is about safety first. PrEP is the best way people can protect themselves against HIV. And it can be done with a pill, taking a pill regularly, and it can now be done via injection as well. So if clients are sexually active, ask if they're on PrEP, and if they're not, ask if they've ever considered it, if they'd be interested. And also know about condom use, dental dams, lubrication, sex toy hygienics, ways to clients can keep themselves safe. Make sure clients know about protecting themselves from HPV, which can cause vaginal, cervix, anal cancer. Again, if people are sexually active, they're not using condoms. Even if they're protected against HIV, they're still prone to warts, which could potentially cause cancer. So Gardasil can help prevent that. And just know about STIs in case they come up, the common ones. So again, like I said, last training, easy to look up online. So, and then I'll just talk about asexuality real quick, and then I'll just make a little time for questions. So asexuality and what's called the ACE spectrum. There are varying degrees of asexuality, and I want to make room for this. So I'm talking about sex, but you may very well have clients in the queer community who have varying degrees of sexual desire, and many who may not even have sexual desire, not be interested in sex, but that is a part of their world, and it's a part of how they maybe feel like an outsider, maybe feel marginalized. There are folks who identify as asexual or also call themselves ace, people who do not experience sexual attraction. There are folks who identify as gray A or gray sexual. Those are folks who they are on a spectrum. They're somewhere between sexual and asexual. They don't feel super sexual, but sometimes maybe feel sexual. And then there are demisexual people who only experience sexual attraction once they form a strong emotional connection with someone. And some folks identify as aromantic. So those are folks who don't experience romantic attraction. And there are some folks who identify as asexual / aromantic, where they don't experience sexual or romantic attraction. There's also a term called queer platonic, which are people who experience a type of non-romantic relationship where there is intense emotional connection that goes beyond a traditional friendship. And also one more thing, aces or asexual people commonly use the prefixes of these terms like hetero, homo, bi, and pan in front of the word romantic to describe who they are romantically attracted to. So someone who is asexual might refer to themselves as hetero-romantic, right? Or homo-romantic, for example. All right. Any questions about that before we move to talking about queer pleasure?
Aaron, I see a question in the chat. They're curious. Are there any guidelines for what needs to happen developmentally for someone to be able to participate in kink in a healthy way? For example, a teenager who is still developing a sense of self and autonomy, I would wonder if they can participate in BDSM in a way that is emotionally healthy.
Yeah. I think that's a really great question. I've never encountered teens being interested in BDSM, but I think it's very likely a teenager could express that. So if that ever came up, I think the first thing to do is to talk about it with them, right? To not encourage them to just go try it, but do you know what BDSM is? Do you understand what it entails? Do you understand the safety protocols behind it? Especially the consent piece. And so to do a little kind of sex education with them, like you would with any teenager, before encouraging them to have any kind of sex, to have a conversation with them about it so that they can be really clear about the choices that they're making. But a responsible BDSM community is not going to bring in someone who is at least, not of the age of consent. So it may just start with just basic education. And if it feels okay, if you feel like you have a rapport with the kid, to talk about what about BDSM draws them, what is it that attracts them to BDSM, so that they can at least start to bring to their awareness, what this is about for them. So yeah, I would start with just dialogue. But yeah, it may not be appropriate for them to start engaging in that. Yeah. In fact, I've never heard of that happening. I'm imagining if a teenager opened up this conversation with me, where I would take it. And I think that's what I would do. I would explore with them what makes them curious about this, and do they know what this entails? And it may very well be appropriate to say, hey, wait until you're 18 to get involved in this community.
Any other questions for Aaron?
Okay. So looks like I'll move on. Okay. So we're at the tail end of the sexuality piece. So we're going to talk about, when barriers come up around queer desire. And this is, of course, working within our scope. If clients that we are in a trusting relationship with bring up barriers to their desire with us, how can we work with that, and how can we dialogue about it? Lucy Fielding calls this the process of recentering pleasure. helping clients connect to their own pleasure and to honor it. She names the common barriers to really to trans people connecting to their desire. I also think these are very relevant to queer people connecting to their desire. The first is that queer people may not have a sense of what's possible because they lack the exposure. They just don't know. They've been so immersed in the dominant discourse of what's normal sexuality that they don't know. The other barrier might be that a desire of theirs feels shameful or embarrassing, so it gets buried. Third, their desires might not align with common identity narratives. So there might be like homonormative expectations, like, gay men are supposed to like anal sex. Or women are supposed to be, monogamous. Women aren't supposed to want more than one partner. And then a fourth barrier would be not feeling deserving of desire because of internalized transphobia or homophobia. So she talks about how to address each of these barriers. So let's go with the first one. When one doesn't have a sense of what's possible, if someone doesn't even know where to start, how can we work with the client to kind of move them to understanding what's possible for them? One way is through queer erotic resources, queer erotic literature and ethical porn, which I've mentioned before. The Crash Pad series and Aorta films are examples of ethical porn where you know that there hasn't been any kind of coercion or manipulation, right? It's fully consensual porn. But looking at porn can be a good way to understand what's possible for you and what turns you on. And those films also feature a wide variety of bodies and identities in the queer community. And then another way is of doing what's called a yes, no, maybe worksheet. So you can actually literally write down on a worksheet at the top categories of yes, no, and maybe. And when you think about certain things to do sexually, certain behaviors, any kind of things that come up in erotic fantasies, what appeals to you? And write that in the yes category. What for sure appeals to you goes in the yes category. And then what certainly turns you off goes in the no. And then things you're not unsure about. Maybe there are things, maybe I would need to try that to know fully, go in the maybe category. And you can actually write that worksheet as you read or watch erotic porn, right? Talk to friends. Also, that's another thing. Talk to people you know about what they enjoy, what they're into. Be open and curious. And then the other piece of this is for them to explore and interact with their body uninterrupted for a specific time. So Fielding recommends about between 15 and 30 minutes. So, kind of set a clock and have that time be just with your body. And just go ahead and explore your body, what feels good. And then notice what fantasies come up as you explore your body. Without judgment, just notice. And so you can integrate the use of that exercise, the body exploration exercise, and the yes, no, maybe worksheet, along with the porn, to kind of get a sense of what's possible, and then what you might be into, what the client might be into. And then there's when one is ashamed or embarrassed about what they desire. A lot of times people are embarrassed or ashamed because of, quote, shoulds and oughts. So Fielding recommends identifying the shoulds and oughts that have guided you towards, what you think is normal sexuality. You might consider Gail Rubin's charmed circle exercise. In the mid-'80s, a philosopher named Gail Rubin came up with this idea of the charmed circle. These were a set of sexual desires and behaviors that were considered normal, right? And non-pathological. So everything in that charm circle was perfectly fine sexually, but anything outside of that circle was not. And so if you grew up with that charm circle, like most of us did, you were very likely to have internalized that. And so that might be a way to kind of elicit the shoulds and oughts. But you can kind of go through with the client, have them list, what did you learn was normal sexuality, what you were supposed to be into, what it was not okay to be into. Just get real clear about that. What did you learn about this kind of sex, right? And you might even use narrative therapy strategies around the role of heteronormativity. And I'll touch on that after this slide and kind of revisit narrative therapy strategies. And identify safety measures as, if necessary. Sometimes it's just about how can you do this and keep yourself safe? You can integrate safety without shame, right? So, how can you practice safe sex without shame? How can you make a safe agreement with someone and, get really dirty with someone and real messy, and enjoy yourself and still make sure you're safe. And then explore the non-literal aspects of the desire with ethical curiosity. So with that deep compassion-based meaning, behind what they want. What is it about this that makes you feel so alive? Right? Yeah. What is it about anal penetration? Right? Or what is it about the experience of being tied up and spanked that feels so meaningful for you? And when you ask it with an openness and a curiosity versus a judgmental tone, it can actually really open up. It's some really beautiful conversation. So if you ask that question, make sure you're in that ethically curious space. So this is a reminder about how to help a client queer their narrative. I talked about this in the last training. This is pulling from narrative therapy. So if a client is embarrassed about a certain sexual desire that they have, you can externalize the problem. And the problem often is one of these discourses, right? The problem, you're not the problem is the problem. The problem is heteronormativity tells you that this is not okay. So you externalize the problem, right? And talk about that. So you think anal sex is dirty. And you've learned this from the power of heteronormativity. Heteronormativity and homophobia have taught you that, have pushed this idea that anal sex is not okay. That's something that you might arrive to when you break it down with the client. So, and then the second step would be you identify exceptions to the problem. Has there ever been a time when you didn't feel dirty thinking about that or doing that act? And the client may find, yes, there was a moment. Tell me about that. Tell me about the exception when it didn't feel bad or dirty. And you really go into that. And then you listen to the preferred stories. How would you like to think about this in the future? How would you like to relate to, your desire, to receive anal sex, to bottom, right? And they may say something like, I form relationships with other people who like to bottom, and we talk about our experiences. And I meet up with tops who really care about me and who really enjoy that part of me, right? So you're really cultivating their preferred story to beef that up and to kind of bring down the charge of the dominant cultural narrative, right? And you really just spend time developing those preferred stories. A lot of times documenting the preferred stories is a piece of it as well, where you actually have the client write it down. So you may do that for sexuality if it feels right, but it may not be necessary. It may be just enough to just develop and beef up those preferred stories. So you start with a lot of the shame that comes up around sexuality is going to be because of one of these discourses, these dominant discourses. So you can always start by framing it that way, and then helping the client tune into their preferred story so that this is not the dominant narrative for them anymore. Okay, the other barrier that can come up is when desires don't align with common identity narratives. So in that case, you might identify homonormative or gender normative narratives related to sexuality. So gay men are supposed to like anal sex might be something, that, certain men hear. Femme women can't be dominant. Women should be monogamous. Men should be more dominant, right? So this can be a barrier, these kinds of narratives. So again, you can use those narrative therapy tools to challenge those dominant narratives, those identity narratives. And then help the client create action items to center their desire. So for example, create online profiles clarifying their desires. I work with clients sometimes to do that, to actively seek out someone who is into what you're into and will honor how you're showing up, right? Role play and practice telling potential partners what you're into. So yeah, like if you're a man and you like being more submissive, talk about that with potential partners, be upfront about that. Future templating. Have the client imagine asserting their desires in a sexual scenario, saying, this is what I like, this is what I want, right? So like say like a gay man, I talked about anal sex in the gay community, the homonormative narrative that gay men should like anal sex. But if there's someone who's aside, they might actually imagine putting that out there to people and imagining asserting themselves as a side in a sexual scenario, saying, hey, there's a lot of other hot things we can do. Let's try this. So just kind of have them imagine playing that out and what that's like. And finally, when the other barrier, the fourth barrier, is when one feels undeserving of desire due to internalized transphobia or homophobia. So the first thing to do is to, if that's the case, validate the reality of the challenges they face. There are very real challenges. There's something called dating while trans, which I hear trans and non-binary folks talk about a lot, where it's like the dating pool feels extremely limited when you're dating while trans. And dating pools in general can be very narrowed in the queer community. And queer relationships are very negatively viewed by others, especially in certain parts of the country. So validate that there is this reality that, sometimes, you're seen as less than. And then at the same time, help the client claim their entitlement to desire. And one thing you can do is to ask it what Lucy Fielding calls intimate justice questions. And this is what intimate justice questions look like. Ask them, what messages have you picked up in your life about pleasure, especially as a queer person? How have the following people or groups influenced your beliefs or assumptions about sexuality and pleasure? You just kind of go through that list there. Who are your erotic role models? I think that's a really important one. Are there people that who are models for you, people you've befriended or people you know from afar? There might even be certain porn stars out there. Tell me about a time you experienced pleasure in your body. What images or sensations bubbled up into consciousness and what utterly surprised you? What in your life makes you feel liberated? What does your most pleasurable life look like? Lucy Fielding calls these intimate justice questions because it's about connecting to the intimate self while also countering the oppression that one has often felt and experienced around their sexuality. So these are questions that we can kind of ask our clients and be present as they sit with them and explore them, if they are open to it. So just a note, I mentioned this earlier, but I'll say again, there are certain circumstances where when you're talking about recentering pleasure, whatever that is for the client, whatever kind of sexuality they're into, if you're talking about recentering it, honoring it, there are certain things that can come up in that process where you'll need to pause and reroute. And these are circumstances where you require more focused skill and interventions and require their own training, frankly. And one of those is when there is a sexual dysfunction that is distressing for the client or their partner, right? It's clear to sexual dysfunction. There's a problem with maybe sexual desire or arousal. That probably requires sex therapy, and it requires skilled sex therapy. The other would be a sexual compulsion or addiction. Sometimes we use the word addiction lightly when talking about sex, but this can also be include drug addiction, right? So if a compulsion or addiction comes up that interferes with the client's self-esteem, their relationships, or their work functioning, then you need to pivot. And that will require management and stabilization of their impulses, their compulsive behavior. And that will require using the right tools, getting them into probably group therapy, support groups to deal with that. And then also re-traumatization or trauma reenactment can occur. Connecting queer people to their bodies, I would say especially trans people to their bodies, it can be re-traumatizing. So if that comes up, you're working with dissociation and fragmentation to a degree, and that's going to require that trauma-informed training that I really emphasize. So in those cases, you'll be doing trauma work and helping them process through whatever trauma comes up as they explore their sexuality and their body. So I wanted to mention that. Here are some other queer sex resources. For online education, I really recommend TASHRA, which stands for the Alternative Sexualities Research Alliance. They're fantastic. You can find all sorts of research on there, and you can find a lot of trainings on alternative sexualities, especially kink and BDSM. So highly recommend TASHRA. And I highly recommend the Hump Film Festival. So the Hump Film Festival is a porn festival that was created by Dan Savage. And it now runs in a lot of cities across the country. And I checked, it runs in Washington, D.C., which I think is the closest to you all. And I think it's in April, but you can look at their website. I have it listed there, humpfilmfest.com. And the Hump Film Festival is a porn festival for the purpose of normalizing sexuality. So, most porn is designed to titillate. The Hump Film Festival was really to say, hey, this, all people have sex. This is what sexuality looks like. So when you go to that film festival, you watch the movies, you will see people of all sizes, physical abilities, different genders, different sexualities having sex. And so I've talked a lot about sexuality today, but there is something about actually seeing people have sex and how that's been shared by people in homemade videos that I think will demystify it for you even more. So I really recommend the Hump Film Festival. Look it up. And I think you need to actually go to the film festival to see it. But on their website, you can actually stream old film festival movies, the packages. And you have to pay for it. I can't remember how much, but I would definitely recommend that. And also the Asexuality, Visibility, and Education Network, their website is there. And there's some books for sex, The Joy of Gay Sex, Trans Sex by Lucy Fielding, I've quoted her a lot today, and The Joy of Lesbian Sex. All right. So I'm thinking we'll take a break. Also, queer sex and romance resources for clients. So websites, dating sites that clients can go to if they want to reach out. You're all going to have access to this presentation afterwards, so you can look at that later. Okay, so we'll take a break, but any questions before we do? No?
Okay. I don't see any in the chat, Aaron.
Okay, so let's do 10 minutes and we'll come back and talk about gender exploration and transition.
All righty. So everyone, please take your 10-minute break. We will start promptly at 12:06. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. Next hour. So we'll try to complete this in the next hour. It's possible I might need extra 15 minutes, but I'll check in with everybody. this is a brand new training. I had much more material than I expected. So we're getting into gender exploration and transition, which there were requests to hear more about. So I do want to dive a little bit more into that. Again, I'll reiterate, this is not to be a substitution for a gender assessment training, which I will recommend to you if you're interested in doing formal gender assessments in the in the service of writing letters for surgery. This is for if you have a client in your practice who is trans or non-binary, and you're forming a relationship with them, and they are in the process of transitioning or have told you that they want to start transitioning. This is just to give you a base knowledge and some tools for that. So we'll start with gender exploration, just as a sort of review. In the last training, I talked about the phases of development, and one of those phases of identity development was phase 3, exploration. So during the exploration phases, usually when you're talking with clients about their gender identity, and and they're wanting to explore that, and I talked about ways to do that, ways to open that dialogue. So one way to start, as I said, is with some sort of visual exercise that uses some visual of a spectrum. And I started with this very, very common worksheet called the Genderbread Person. It's very commonly used with young people, and there's different variations of it. It's there's I think there's one called Gender Unicorn. There's one called Gender Gumby. I think so. There's different ways to do this, but this is a good one with young people. Even preteens, to explore just the entirety of their gender and sexual being. And but I also might use this for teenagers. Especially older teenagers and adults, is just a kind of a simple spectrum of regarding gender expression or gender identity. And I might start with, one line. For gender expression, it's between feminine and masculine. For gender identity, it's between female and male. And remember, gender expression and gender identity are different. One can identify as their gender identity as male, for example, but their gender expression can be femme or feminine. So people can fall anywhere on the spectrum for either. A line is where I might start, but a line can also be limiting for some folks. But it's a starting point for people who are just kind of wondering, where they fall in terms of gender. So I might do something like take out a piece of paper and draw a line. One says, gender expression, and one line says gender identity. Just ask them to just mark it. Not particularly quantifiable, just to draw a mark somewhere as an opener for our dialogue. And then we can ask them what led them to mark there. I might also encourage them to kind of color outside of the lines, so to speak. I have markers in my office, and so if they want to, if one mark doesn't quite do it, maybe they color in a portion of it, right? Or they draw something else that represents their experience of gender, and then we open up even further dialogue about that. So just in general, this is, I think, increasingly kind of an outdated version of the gender spectrum, but I think it's kind of a place to kind of start. Again, just to review, we might see gender on a spectrum somewhat between male and female if we're talking about identity. And along that spectrum are kind of gradations or variations of gender. So towards the male end, we have what's called a transmasculine identity, or a trans male non-binary identity. And same with over on the female end, a trans feminine or trans female non-binary identity. And in the middle, someone kind of who identifies in the middle of the spectrum might identify as non-binary, probably most commonly. So if someone identifies as specifically trans male or trans female, the closer to the end of the spectrum would be called a binary trans identity. And for some folks, like I said, if that is too limiting, some people may experience gender on other levels or other inner dimensions. So, another way to try it is with something like a triangle where you have male and female on one end, but on another corner, there's a sense of no gender, which is what agender means. It's like it's not having a particular sense of gender. So maybe instead of marking themselves on a line, they'll mark themselves somewhere around here, anywhere. So the idea really is to open up dialogue around gender if a client is wanting to explore it, is curious about that for themselves. So, on that gender spectrum, I, just showed you the kind of the most common gender identities, right? You've got male, female, trans masculine, trans feminine, non-binary. And that said, there are other forms of gender identity and expression that I just want to list. So when a client starts to identify their gender in a particular way, it may show up, in a lot of different ways, and they may choose a particular term that aligns with their identity and their expression. So I have some other terms there laid out. And we don't have time to go into them, but I will say that they're pretty easy to look up online. And always talk to a client when a client says what their gender identity is. I would say actually when they say what their queer identity is, it's important to really ask them what they mean by it. We can go look the term up, but it really comes down to what does that mean for you, right? So it comes to the third S in that equation I talked about, significance, the meaning. So once clients explore their gender with you, at a certain point, once they get to phase 4 in identity development, then the interest in transitioning starts to come up, and they'll start to just talk about an interest in transitioning once they have a sense of gender identity. And so transitioning means, how they want to start kind of manifesting a sense of gender congruence. So when we talk about gender transition, just to be clear what it is, gender transition is about decreasing gender incongruence and gender dysphoria. But I think most particularly, it's about increasing gender congruence and gender euphoria. So gender incongruence is the experience of the body not aligning with the assigned sex at birth. And so gender congruence is there is a sense of alignment. We talk a lot about gender dysphoria, and I mentioned this in the last training, but I think it's important to talk more actually about gender euphoria, because what we want for the client and what the client really wants is more experiences of gender euphoria. So when we talk about gender transition, we're really talking about increasing gender congruence and gender euphoria. And gender transition is also part of one's gender journey, which a journey is not necessarily linear. So it's important to keep that in mind as well. We may bring in an assumption about what it means to transition and kind of this linear sense of it, but it actually, it's not a straight path, and I'll talk more about that in just a bit. So just more about gender incongruence and gender dysphoria. There's commonly 3 key aspects of identifying gender incongruence and gender euphoria or gender dysphoria. That is insistence, persistence, and consistency. So the client is insistent of their gender identity, and that has persisted over time, and it's been consistent through different domains. That's often the kind of the equation or the gauge to identify that gender incongruence and gender dysphoria is happening. Gender incongruence is, like I said, it's when gender identity is not aligned with gender assigned at birth. Gender dysphoria describes the feelings of pain, agitation, restlessness, malaise that gender variant people often express. It is a very real thing, and it's also a diagnosis in the DSM that I think unfortunately we have to use as part of being in the system. So gender incongruence and gender dysphoria are connected, but they're different. And one can experience gender incongruence without experiencing gender dysphoria. Okay, so I think that's important. And when it comes to medical transition, as we'll see, gender dysphoria that's when the diagnosis really becomes necessary. So as we move forward, I'm doing this training with gender affirming principles. I identify as a gender affirmative therapist. So that's full disclosure. Gender affirming care is really the primary model of care for working with trans and non-binary clients. It is the model of care that WPATH holds, the World Professional Association of Transgender Health holds. And I feel a need to distinguish gender affirmative care from what's come to be called gender exploratory care. There has been there's a real kind of conflict in the field around these two forms of care. So gender exploratory care, I think, stemmed from this Brown University study that I talked about in my last training around, and specifically around parents concerned of rapid onset gender dysphoria, this idea that gender dysphoria just came on suddenly because of social contagion. So there was this sense that people, especially kids, were rushing too fast to get gender affirming medical care. So gender exploratory care is now a thing, and I think there are two primary distinctions that I've been able to discern. One is that in gender affirming care, we honor the client's stated gender identity and gender expression, whatever that is, and we honor their gender journey, whatever their age is. In gender exploratory care, one does not do that. The clinician would say, let's hold off on doing that. You're a boy, we're going to say you're a boy for now, and then we're going to explore why you say you want to be another gender. So that's one distinction. Another distinction is that medical intervention for gender exploratory care, medical intervention is a very, very last resort. It's not to be used unless someone is like completely desperate. And so gender affirming care, it does not take that position. Gender affirming care takes the position that medical intervention is a valid intervention as part of someone's gender journey and gender process. So I just want to be clear about that. You might hear about gender exploratory care, and those are the basic differences from what I can gather, the key differences. And so gender exploratory care, I think, was also founded by cisgender people and consists mostly of cisgender people. So here are the gender affirming principles as we move forward. Gender affirming principles are no gender identity or expression is pathological. Gender presentations are diverse and vary across cultures, cultural contexts, and intersectional lenses. Gender may be fluid and non-binary. Any pathology that is present is more often caused by cultural reactions to gender diversity than by internal psychological disturbances. So there really is a systemic approach to gender affirmative care. There is a focus on resilience, coping, and wellness, and these principles require the clinician to consider our own biases around gender. So we hold these in mind as we kind of walk our trans clients through the gender transition process and their gender journey. I would encourage you to just kind of come back to those principles. This is just a reminder of the language that we use, how to use gender affirming language, the most current terminology, and how to degender our language. So I'll be using this terminology moving forward, and you'll have this for your reference after this. All right, so gender transition. When a client talks about wanting to transition, we keep in mind that there are 3 transition pathways, and the first is pretty much always the socially transitioning. Then there's medically transitioning, and then finally legally transitioning. So we might play a part in walking with the client through this process. So we'll start with social transition. And social transition often involves these these steps. The first is coming out. Oftentimes, when a client decides that they want to transition, that they're going to start going by a different name, using different pronouns, appearing a certain way, they kind of need to let people know. So there is a disclosure process. And I talked about that in our last training, in phase 4, how you can start to help clients connect to the most trusted sources in their lives, right? Who are the family and friends that they're closest to, that they trust the most, and start to let those people in on what's happening. And then also start to connect to affirming social support that can also support them through that process. Some trans people, choose to write a letter to tell, kind of all of the close people in their lives at once. So that may be something that they choose to do and that you work with clients on. But there may be kind of an initial coming out process of how do you talk to people about your gender identity and what is to come with the social transition. So the coming out process is a sort of preparation. And then there is utilizing forms of address, specifically name and pronouns. So in my experience, in choosing a name, a trans client has never struggled with choosing a name. It's something that they've thought about for a long time. It is something that potentially could come up in their work with you. So that might be something we end up helping them with, helping them kind of do some inquiry around what kind of name would they want, what would they want to be called. But in my experience, I have found that hasn't been needed. And then pronouns, just a reminder about pronouns. Most of you would probably know about this or remember it. Typically, there are the feminine, masculine, and gender neutral. And then there are other pronouns, other kind of more gender neutral pronouns that might be used as well. So the client will choose their name, the pronouns that they want to use, and start actually asking people to call them by that name and those pronouns. And then the next part of the process is changing appearance and presentation. So that often starts with clothing, hair, and makeup. And a part of that is there's a process of finding one's personal style. And I put there regardless of gender norms, because gender norms, the cultural discourse might say, what is the right way to be masculine, for example, or to be a man or to be a woman, where a trans person's own experience of gender might not align with that at all. I've had this experience many times with trans folks, a trans male who identifies as male, but internally is just very, creative and likes actually more androgynous things. So that has a lot to do with how do you tune into your personal style, connect with it, and honor it. There might even be some narrative style therapy to do around that, right? What have you been told a man is supposed to be, for example? And then what is your experience of being male? And then kind of how does that kind of manifest in how you present yourself with clothing and hair and so forth. It is important that clients get connected to trans affirming professionals. If you're working with trans clients, see if you can get to know who the trans affirming hairstylists are and makeup people. There was a place in the Bay Area, I remember, called MAC, a makeup place that was known for being very trans friendly. So I would direct my trans clients to MAC because I knew that they would oftentimes be taken care of there. And also even places that they can buy clothes. I said in our last training, it's important when you refer clients out to know what the trans competency level is of those other professionals, those other doctors and lawyers and such, but that includes in the realm of style. Know who the trans competent, trans friendly people are. They will also probably want to receive coaching and guidance from peers and professionals. So, encourage them to use their peer support to help them find their own style and get a sense of how they want to appear and present. And then trying things out, doing small things a little bit at a time. Buying just a little bit of makeup, buying a little bit of lipstick, and seeing just how that feels. Instead of doing a whole bunch of makeup at once can be helpful. Trying one small skirt. So a little bit at a time can be helpful. So hair replacement can be a thing. Just balding and then getting rid of hair can both be issues when it comes to changing appearance. So hair replacement can be a thing for trans men because testosterone or T causes hair loss. So trans men are often interested in hair replacement, and then trans women, of course, some have lost their hair, so they're interested in hair replacement as well. So there are some options for folks. It's helpful to know about this. Testosterone blockers like finasteride or dutasteride, minoxidil, of course, and then there's the option of hair transplants and wigs, of course. For trans women, hair removal becomes important for the face and the body, especially if it's very thick. But it can be cost prohibitive. The most effective form of hair removal is electrolysis that permanently removes the follicle. It is a very painful and slow process. It happens over several sessions, over several hours. I gave a little kind of cost estimate there. Someone reported 75 hours of electrolysis cost them $4,000. So it does add up. Laser hair reduction, it covers more area and it's a little less painful, but it doesn't permanently get rid of the hair. It thins it out a lot and it stops it from it pauses the growth. It keeps it from growing as fast, but it doesn't totally get rid of it. And I put a kind of a cost estimate for that as well. So if it feels like too much for clients, they feel like they can't afford it, an option is to save up for it, or to do something like a GoFundMe page, or sometimes people can will offer this at low cost. So you might find out what the options are, and also figure out the hair removal places that are trans friendly and trans competent. Very important. And if clients can't afford that or can't do it, then a regimented hair removal routine will probably be necessary. Voice is a part of changing appearance or changing presentation. Trans men, voice is usually not an issue because T lowers the voice. But some trans men still want to work on their voice, but mostly vocal coaching is for trans women. That's just to help them adjust their tone and their pitch, because feminizing hormones do not change the voice. Masculinizing hormones change the voice. Feminizing hormones do not. But another option for trans women may be vocal cord surgery. Again, it's another expense. Then there's also non-medical body modification. And that can happen with, oftentimes devices that make the body look a different way. So for trans men, packing is relatively common. So packing is packing kind of the front of the crotch with something that makes it look and feel like male genitals. So it can be self-made, like made with like a stuffed sock, for example, or something professionally made that actually looks very realistic, like penis and testicles. These are called packers. Packers can be soft. They can be hard. The hard ones can be used for sex and can be used to penetrate during sex. They can be also dual use. Also, stand-to-pee devices, also called STP devices, are used by trans men and trans masculine folks. And sometimes stand-to-pee devices are kind of combined with a packing device. So it does what it indicates. It connects to the urethra and allows one to pee standing up. Then there is also tucking for trans women or trans feminine folks. I mentioned earlier when I was talking about the inguinal canal and talking about muffing in a way to stimulate that canal, the testicles can get pushed up into the canal. And so that's partly how tucking happens. You'll hear drag queens talk about this, and trans women do this as well. They'll push the testicles up into the canal and then tape back the penis. So when tucking happens, it's important to emphasize safety, especially with the tape. Use like sort of medical tape, for example, something that can, that doesn't rip off the skin, right? And also emphasize comfort, of course, and security. There are certain there's certain undergarments that are used that people can order that are specifically for tucking that keep everything in, that keep the penis back and keep the testicles in. And there are lots of resources online for how to tuck safely. Then there's non-surgical breast enhancement. So kind of what can folks use as breasts? Again, can be used, can be made at home, or there are things you can buy online for trans feminine folks. And finally, binding for trans masculine folks, which is the process of binding the breasts so that the chest looks and appears and feels flat. These can be self-made or professionally made. Professionally, the professional ones that you purchase online are generally the preferred ones because they are safe. They are the safest option. Homemade binding oftentimes risks. There's health risks to it, like cutting the skin and cutting off blood circulation. Like a common way of binding for people who don't have the resources is using bandages, like ACE bandages, and that's actually not a very safe way to bind. But people do it because it so firmly binds the breast down. But it is very uncomfortable and it can create health problems. But there are other ways to bind, and just like with tucking, there are resources online for how to bind safely. So, you're emphasizing safety and you're emphasizing comfort. And some guys are so uncomfortable with binding that they give it up, I find, and they just kind of wear loose fitting shirts. So here are some resources for non-medical body modification. I find this helpful to know as a therapist, like what some of these resources are. It's good to be able to point clients to this. So for trans masculine products, packing, STP, and binding products, you can go to those. Those are good websites to go to that are listed there. The Trans Guy Supply, tomboy.com, Paxies, etc. People can get free binders if people can't afford binders because they're pretty expensive. People can get free binders at pointofpride.com. Because then you'll have access to these slides, so you'll be able to see this later. And then tucking products can be purchased at paxies.com and on Clockable. And then non-surgical breast enhancement products can be purchased at Unclockable. And there's some resources for just safety instructions. You can find safety instructions a lot of places online. You can even find YouTube videos. So a lot of really good resources online these days, but here's some ideas of where people can go for safe binding and safe tucking. And of course, I emphasize at the end, a trusted peer and provider is always the best help. Have someone you can actually go to and talk to and help you in person. The other piece of social transition is navigating public spaces. So clients are likely to be misgendered, for example. So we talk to them about how will they handle that? Do they want to correct people right away, or when do they want to correct people? When do they want to let it slide? Navigating public bathrooms will become a thing when social transition happens. Deciding what bathroom they want to go to. We must validate the stress around that, of having to choose oftentimes. If you live in an area, so oftentimes in an urban area, like I live in Chicago right now, gender neutral bathrooms are kind of a norm. You can go to any kind of restroom or store, and it's very common, but in other cities, it's not. So there's a lot more stress around which bathroom to choose, and especially around locker rooms, especially for people who are non-binary. There's a lot of stress around what locker room to choose. So we may end up dialoguing with the client about their process around that and what feels like the most right option for them at different moments, in different settings. Also being read correctly, just dealing with that out in the space, out in the public space. Sometimes the issue of being openly trans versus being stealth or private can come up. And a client may want to talk about that. Like, do I want to tell people that I'm trans? Do I want to just be open about that? Or if I pass, should I just be private about it and not tell people? That may be something that clients kind of question or struggle with, and they may bring into the therapy space. There's also the issue of online privacy. These days people can look you up online and find out your old name, your dead name, and your past life and everything. And trans folks usually need to protect themselves from this. So talking about online privacy, how to get a pseudonym, how to set privacy settings on social networks, and monitor, and just keep an eye on your online reputation. Just monitor it. There's often an experience of learning new gender rules that trans people have when they transition. So things like social etiquette, like how to show up with men or with women, or even with children. I remember a trans guy talking about how before he transitioned, he loved kids and he would love, going to the park and playing and looking at kids. And when once he started presenting as male, like that was not okay anymore. A lot of people saw it as creepy. So like, what do you do with those kinds of of social etiquettes and those kind of ways that people expect you to show up now that you're presenting as a different gender. And then along with that, there's what one is expected to know. And once you start presenting as a woman, there may be things that people start expecting you to just know about. Maybe you're just expected to just know about how to shop for certain clothes, or how to put on makeup, or how to cook. Trans people are often like taken aback by that. Like, oh, there's this whole world, and I didn't even know I was supposed to know that. So there's often a process of either choosing, do I get to know that? Is that a world I want to be a part of, or is there anything that doesn't fit with who I am? But anyway, still learning what the rules are, right? Even if you have to decide to break them. And then there's flirting and dating norms, that may come up that one is not familiar with. And then there's just questioning, kind of like I mentioned a moment ago, how do these rules square with one's sense of self? So there's kind of the process of identifying, talking about these new rules as one realizes them, and then kind of deciding how they square with them. And then also over time, there is the allowing for identities to change. And this goes back to the model I talked about in the last training over the summer. When we talk about gender identity, the process of it and moving through phases, it's important to allow for re-engagement with an earlier phase. So someone might get to a point of identifying as trans feminine, for example, but maybe they decide, no, maybe I'm non-binary. Something has happened, something has shifted in my life to make me realize that I need to re-explore that. And maybe, so leaving room for that to change is also an important part of social transition, that transition is not necessarily fixed, and that we make room for that. All right, so I'll just get into medical treatment. Just a review of medical treatment, medical transition. This is a slide from my last training. Medical treatment started in the 1960s. It was very regimented with Harry Benjamin, and his work influenced the gender identity clinics in the United States. And it was regimented in the sense that it had to be trans feminine, male to female. They had to prove that they really wanted to be girls in a very clear gender role way. That they wanted to be women in the way that society defined woman. There was usually a long wait before one could have the hormones and the surgery. One had to live as the opposite gender. One had to go through lots of psychotherapy, right? And then over time, there were shifts in transgender care. The university gender clinics closed. There was the privatization of transgender care starting in the 80s. More treatment of trans masculine folks started happening. The standards of care started to be developed, and those were also pretty regimented. Asked a lot of the clients, and then by the 90s, we started having more informed consent models for trans healthcare. So less and less clients were called on to do this extensive psychotherapy to prove that they were the opposite gender, right? To live at least 2 years in their gender. All of these requirements kind of started to fall away by the 2000s. So things are very different now. So if clients express that they're interested in in any kind of medical transition, these are just some things to know about. The WPATH standards of care, the most recent standards of care, which is called Standards of Care 8 for adults, lay out this. And this is particularly for gender affirming surgery. So they say that the gender incongruence is marked and sustained. 6 months of HRT, which is hormone replacement therapy, is recommended before surgery, but it's not required. And so it used to be required. HRT used to be required before surgery. Now it's recommended, but not required. There needs to be a discussion about the negative impact on the outcome of gender-affirming surgeries and the risks and the benefits, and the client demonstrates the capacity to comprehend. So you have to show the client has informed consent, they have the capacity to give informed consent. And you have to show that no other issue is creating the gender incongruence or gender dysphoria. Any serious mental health or medical issues are accounted for and under control, so that to ensure that the client recovers from the procedure. And these are the standards of care for adolescents. And they're a little bit more rigid, understandably so. So there needs to be a thorough biopsychosocial assessment that includes the parents or the caregivers. Tanner stage 2, before any consideration of any kind of medical treatment or surgery. There is, and so that means that they've reached a certain level of puberty. Parental consent is required for puberty blockers or HRT. There must be sustained gender incongruence. Mental health issues affecting medical care are addressed. Fertility risks are discussed. So all of that needs to be addressed before puberty blockers or HRT. And then for surgery, they must be on blockers for 12 months or HRT unless contraindicated, and 1 to 2 years minimum of documented longstanding gender incongruence. And so I just have a slide for gender dysphoria only because it's required that it be in the letter for surgery. So just something that we need to know. And this is a slide from the summer as well. It's important for us to know the medical transition basics. I have them outlined here, and I go through them one at a time, which I will in a minute. So when a client brings up that they want to medically transition, they're interested into looking into it, they need our support, they need a support letter, then we're kind of on the path of starting to do an assessment to provide that letter. And as I've said, if a client is looking for a gender assessment, I need to do a formal assessment with that client. So, and I do not recommend, do not do a gender assessment unless you've been trained to do one. If a client who I've seen for a while is interested in medical transition, then I've seen them for a while, then I'm assuming that I've done enough of an assessment, and then where I have not, then I'm going to do the assessment that I need in order to write the letter. So in doing this process, it's important to understand our provider bias. Again, kind of really doing that examination where we look inward. Know that your ideal care plan isn't necessarily the same as your client's or realistic. So we may have an idea about, how the client is, to recover from surgery or how things are to unfold for them. But we really need to tune into what the client needs and wants for themselves. There needs to be a focus on client safety and recovery. We want to join with the client in the shared goal of wanting the best outcomes for hormones or surgery possible. And remember that true informed consent means ensuring that clients have all the information necessary to make decisions for themselves, and honoring self-determination means that people have the right to decide what to do with that information. So informed consent and self-determination are really key terms in this process here. So part of our job is to make sure the client has all the information, that they're getting it either from us or from their medical provider, and we're working together with the medical provider to provide that information. And that that they have the self-determination to make those decisions based on the information they have. And also we should challenge or interrogate what it means for us to be in a position to decide for someone else whether they're ready, appropriate, or a good candidate. So really understand that we have a gatekeeping role in this system, and just kind of know what that means. Right? I think it's important to approach that with some sense of humility, and really be clear about the limits of that. So what it means to interrogate that role, some questions to consider is, what motivates me to do this work? Why am I doing this? Why am I helping this client through this? Looking at your own motivation. And then what biases and subjectivities do I bring to this role? And to make sure that if it's not about the client's best interest, to just set that aside. And also, how am I connected to trans communities in a meaningful and substantial way beyond professional trainings? Do you know trans people in your life? Are you connected to transgender organizations? Are you doing other transgender trainings? Really be sure that you are connected to the trans community. If you are cisgender, make sure that you are connected to the transgender community. So that can really help keep you in a place of understanding what your responsibility is here. So I'll briefly say something about hormone therapy, just so you know what it is, and we can talk a little bit about, you're able to talk a little bit about it with the client. I have some slides on the different surgeries, only because it gives us a way, it gives us information in a way that we can talk about it with the client in order to make sure that they have informed consent. So we won't have time for all of the slides, but I'll go through them as much as I can. And again, you will have these to look at. So feminizing hormone therapy consists of anti-androgens and estrogen. So it suppresses testosterone and then offers estrogen. Routes of administration are often a daily pill. Sometimes it's by injection or a dermal patch. So the client will talk to their doctor about the best option for them. The androgen blocker suppresses the effects of testosterone. It's important to know common effects, what will happen once they start taking it, what's likely to happen, and what are some other possible effects. So this is part of the informed consent, just to make sure that they know what's going to happen. And usually they will talk this over with their doctor. And then also know what the effects of the estrogen are, what they can expect. You want to understand the risks and the benefits. So the benefits of the estrogen are oftentimes what they want. They're going to want softer skin, breast development, the redistribution in body fat. They're going to want a lot of that, but also know that there's going to be risks as well. And they should also know what the feminizing hormones will not change. The facial hair won't completely disappear. The cartilage around the trachea, what's called the Adam's apple, that won't shrink. Vocal pitch won't change, and the bone or body structure won't change. So just notice that. So euphoria and dysphoria may kind of happen concurrently, right? With changes from hormones. And then masculinizing hormone therapy, often called testosterone or T, is often given through an injection, either intramuscular or subcutaneous, sometimes with a cream or a patch. Common permanent changes, male pattern baldness. And once you go off testosterone, the baldness doesn't change. That doesn't go away. Deepening of the voice and enlarged clitoral tissue also doesn't change. Once the hormones change that, there's no going back. So it's important for clients to change that, to understand that. And then the reversible changes from T are listed there as well. It's things that happen, but they go away. Oops. So we want to help the client support, we want to support the client's realistic expectations. So once they start hormones, and if they start hormones, they'll probably, they may want surgery afterwards, and not always. Sometimes hormones is all people want. Sometimes people want surgery without the hormones. But I think especially once you start talking about surgery, it's important to start setting realistic expectations and supporting those. So what we want to balance the support for clients' hopefulness while building resilience for possible setbacks, okay? So let them know there might be setbacks. Help clients manage expectations for recovery, including the type and the amount of care needed, the speed of healing, caregivers who will and won't be present. We will always want to encourage clients to research surgical options and talk to people who have completed the surgery when appropriate. They want to get all the information possible. Unrealistic expectations increase the risk of post-operative complication or decompensation. So that's why this is important. Also, gender dysphoria can increase if surgery does not meet expectations. Another reason to support realistic expectations. And also note, it can increase even if it does meet expectations. So you want to just kind of lay that all out there. And building tools for resilience. So we want to help clients increase their coping skills before surgery. So you'll use the tools that you have for helping clients calm down for that. Mentally rehearse the elements of preparation for surgery, recovery, and predict challenges. Help clients think through parts of their lives that likely won't change, right? So you'll still need to meet your responsibilities. You may likely still be misgendered after the surgery, for example. Help clients identify signs that would indicate a need for more support and help them make a plan for obtaining it. So, and then you help them kind of just prepare for the surgery. This is kind of our part as mental health practitioners. Their doctor and their surgeon is doing this as well, but it helps if we can be on board. So part of what we do as mental health practitioners is help clients plan, right? And establish realistic expectations for major life events. So that's kind of what we're doing with the surgery. So we can get kind of a little clued in. We can be a part in doing that. So medical preparation, make sure that they're stabilizing their medical conditions, any medical conditions. Smoking and nicotine should usually be stopped a certain time period before surgery. And make sure that they are, that they anticipate for post-op psychiatric needs, any kind of depression that could occur, trauma activation, mood swings. There is BMI considerations. A lot of surgeons have strict BMI cutoffs. So we may be in the position of supporting clients in meeting those considerations without, of course, encouraging unhealthy eating patterns. And then substance use. Clients should be off substances before the surgery. And some of our clients may be using substances. So there's a piece here about that. Nicotine prevents wound healing. So most surgeons require that clients be nicotine-free before and after surgery. If someone has an opioid addiction, that should be communicated to the surgeon and the anesthesiologist to ensure proper pain management. Clients in recovery may need extra support as the stress of surgery can trigger urges and cravings. And for those actively using substances, it's important to assess whether use interferes with functioning and the inability to care for self. So, of course, there are higher rates of substance abuse in trans communities, and that is correlated with higher rates of discrimination. And disclosure of substance use should be encouraged. Encourage your client to disclose this to the surgeon. So, I'm aware of the time, so I just want to check. Are we okay if we go up to 15 minutes over? Is that okay? And remember, you'll still get this afterwards. Okay. So So remember, in supporting realistic care planning, recovery from the surgery is difficult to do alone. So who else do they have supporting them? This is almost always the case. After surgery, they're going to need support. They're going to need people there to help them. A lot of times, even in the first week, they can't do it alone. So I always want to know, what is your care plan? Who are you going to have around you? Ideally, you should have someone in the house with you, but that may not be possible. But what can we do to shore up as much support as possible? So, types of care, can you maybe need an advocate in the hospital, a ride from home, meal preparation, dressing changes, help with drains, help with chores, help with climbing stairs, emotional support. You can just look at all of the care one might need after surgery. So we want to be helping the client to think of these things and prepare. Also, help plan for securing a recovery space that will support healing, privacy, safety, functional equipment for self-care needs. They're going to need to clean themselves often. They may not be able to take a shower, for a full day or something. How are they going to make sure that they keep themselves safe? Help the client think through the timing of the surgery, right? The time off of work that they might need. When a client does not have readily available resources for recovery, work with them on how to access those resources, right? So if you work with clients from poorer communities, what are the resources for medical respite, Meals on Wheels, home health support? So when they have the resources, great. Encourage them to draw on as many friends that they can, family that they can. If they don't, just really work with them to get as much support as possible. So I cannot emphasize support enough. Normalize typical post-op challenges. Complications can happen even if people follow all the guidelines. So, just kind of help clients balance what they can and can't control. Just know ahead of time that anesthesia and pain medications can cause post-op depression. That's normal. Isolation in recovery, disappointment with care providers, restrictions on activities all contribute to the depression and low mood. In short, depression is common after surgery. Manage their expectations around that. And encourage communication with the surgical team. So anticipate challenges related to self-advocacy. If the client has a hard time speaking up for themselves, anticipate, how are they going to get their needs met? How are they going to recognize that they need help from their doctor and they need to reach out for support? You're going to kind of come up with a post-op care plan with them. Reviewing post-op care needs with the patient is a part of informed consent. So part of informed consent is you know the risks and benefits of this procedure, all that's entailed with it, and then all that's involved in recovery from it. Need to lay it all out there. The tasks for mental health providers are to ensure informed consent. That's part of our job in all of this. We make sure they have the ability to give informed consent. We identify internal and external resources for managing post-op recovery. And we support their development of a plan for obtaining more resources when needed. So if you kind of think of what's my role as a care provider when it comes to medical transition, those are three big things. So I have laid out here the different surgeries, and we don't have time to get into all of them, but this is here for your reference. Okay. I'll just briefly say about top surgery. It is, in my experience, it's been the most common surgery I've seen clients through. Most transmasculine clients, when they have the opportunity and the time is right, want top surgery. It's fair. It's relatively straightforward, and in terms of cost, it's on the lower cost side. Still not cheap, but it's on the lower cost side. And health insurance will cover it if you can provide the letter, making the case for it. So basically, it's top surgery is the reduction in breast tissue, and there are different techniques. There's a lot of different techniques, and you can probably look those up. But most notably, there's one common technique that for people with large breasts that is often necessary, and it leaves scarring. And then there's another technique. It's called the buttonhole technique for people with smaller breasts. It leaves less scarring because you're just going through the nipple, and that can be preferred for people with smaller breasts. But the option for people with larger breasts is the one that leaves the scar. There's the recovery time there, 2 to 4 week acute phase. Oftentimes it's 1 full week where people need, a lot of care and a lot of support from other people. 6 to 9 months for final results. The care needs, it's going to be 3 to 4 days. 24-hour care recommended for the first 3 to 4 days. And post-op considerations, there's the T-Rex arm, so there's mobility restrictions. You want to have your bed at a proper elevation. There may be drains after surgery to clean out and to change. So those are some considerations post-op, just to kind of help clients plan out what this is going to look like. And again, the surgeon will go over this as well with them. Then there's breast augmentation surgery for trans women. A lot of times, feminizing hormones are enough to grow breast tissue that trans women won't feel the need for breast surgery, but occasionally they will want it. And that's a little bit what it looks like. Kind of similar to top surgery in terms of the care needs, the post-op care needs. 24 hours for the first day, 1 week of help with ADLs. Soreness and tightness are normal. It might be difficult to lift things at first. And the recovery course is generally easier than most other gender-affirming surgeries. Hysterectomy and oophorectomy, it might be something that a transmasculine person wants. It's the removal of the uterus, cervix, and fallopian tubes, along with the removal of the ovaries. The recovery is 1 to 3 days of acute recovery, post-laparoscopic surgery. So it's you could say minimally invasive, and 4 to 6 weeks for complete recovery. And then post-op considerations that are normal, things to expect, are laid out there. So of course, the doctor will go over with these things with client, but it can be helpful if we do as well. Then there's, we're getting into bottom surgery, or what I hear more often called now lower surgery. We refer sometimes to top surgery and bottom surgery, and now bottom surgery or genital surgery is being called lower surgery. And one of those lower surgeries is vaginoplasty. The creation of a vulva with the goal of creating labia majora and minora, and creating a vaginal canal and clitoris. So it's a very extensive surgery performed in 2 stages. There are fertility preservation considerations, 6 to 8 weeks of acute phase. And then 6 to 9 months for final results. Post-op considerations that are really important to consider is the dilation. So dilation needs to happen. There are dilation toolkits that usually kind of increase in size to dilate the vaginal canal. And typically one dilates 3 times per day for the first 2 months minimum, and then it's a lifetime of dilation is required for vaginal depth. And then, the client is to get guidance around resuming sexual contact. Vaginoplasties, I would say bottom surgeries in general are much less common because they are so much more involved in terms of the expense, the time off, the level of pain and pain management, and aftercare that's needed. So some trans clients choose not to do it for a variety of those reasons. And we talk about it in session. Sometimes it is experienced as a sense of loss. When I had a trans client talk to me about how she really wanted a vaginoplasty, but she knew she wouldn't be able to, the pain of it and going through the medical treatment was too much for her to bear. And there was grief around having to make the choice to not do it. There's also a vulvoplasty, which is not the creation. You don't create a vaginal canal, but it's just the creation of a vulva, and labia and a clitoris, but no vaginal canal. So this would be for folks who aren't interested in vaginal penetration for sex. So there's a kind of an overview of that. No dilation requirements for vulvoplasty. And then there's an orchiectomy, which is just the removal of the testes. Some trans women are perfectly happy with their penis or whatever they call it, and just want the removal of the testes. And so there's a layout of how that works. Things to consider. There may be future vaginoplasty plans, though. And because there's no endogenous source of hormones, one has to remember bone health. You have to kind of have a way of taking care of your bone health for the rest of your life once you lose that. And that's true for an oophorectomy as well. So just for the sake of time, I'm going to move through this. Metoidioplasty is the creation of the phallus from existing tissue. It's a bottom surgery for trans masculine folks. That's kind of what it involves. The important thing, it's good for us to know kind of what this is. And again, you'll have this for your reference, but the most important thing for us to know is the post-op care needs and the recovery, so that we know that the client knows what to expect and that they're ready for it. They can picture it happening. And then the phalloplasty is the creation of a full phallus from a donor site. So the metoidioplasty is the creation of the phallus from existing tissue, usually involving the release of ligaments. And the phalloplasty is the creation of the phallus using a donor site from a forearm or a thigh. So again, a little outline of that as well. What to expect. And then there are also facial surgeries, facial feminization and facial masculinization surgeries. Body feminization and body masculinization is also something clients may choose. So just a word about hormones and surgery. Most surgeons require people to stop estrogen before surgery. And this can impact mood and increase dysphoria. So something to be aware of. Some surgeries involve removing endogenous source of hormones, like I already mentioned. So people without internal source of hormones will need external source of hormones for life to protect their bone health. Again, something part of informed consent. So I encourage you to get further gender training if you're interested in doing gender assessments on a regular basis. And there is a resource for that. I recommend the Gender Asset course to get your gender assessment training. And also WPATH offers some wonderful foundations courses for more for assessment training, but just transgender health training in general. So I'm just giving you a little taste, right? So you can just start to work with clients there. And then I have to breeze through this, but legal transition is also something we may help clients with. So it often involves starting with a name change and changing all of these documents. Filing for a legal name change is the first step of legal transition. So filing for a name change happens with the local circuit court, and you pay a small filing fee. So for Virginia, you can go to Virginia's local court. You can find it online. Client can, pay a fee, apply for a change of name, and then you wait for a court order recognizing your name change. That court order will allow one to change their name on all their other documents. Once you have that court order in hand, your name is officially changed and you can change it on all that. So it usually makes sense for people to start with their social security card. So they contact the social security office, show them that court order, and get your name officially changed on your social security card, and then on your state ID. Your driver's license will be the next one. And then you can also file for a legal gender marker change. This process varies state to state. In many states, Virginia included, one can change their gender marker on their driver's license or state ID when they apply for an updated card. So that's easy to do. So in the state of Virginia, next time a client gets their driver's license, they can go ahead and mark their gender as different on their driver's license. That's good for clients to know. They don't even need to change their name legally. Okay? Some states don't allow a gender marker change, and many require proof of medical transition first. So Virginia is not one of those states, but like I said, it varies state to state. So the federal government also allows for one to change their gender marker on their updated passport. Another good thing for clients to know. Clients update their passport, they can change their gender on their passport. That's it. They can just do it. Filing for a gender marker change continued. Several states, including Virginia, allow for an X gender on driver's licenses and state IDs. So if someone goes in for an updated driver's license or state ID, they can change their gender to a third gender, to X. They don't have to identify as male or female. They can just identify as X. It's good for your trans clients to know that. Several states allow for gender marker change on a birth certificate with proof that they have medically transitioned. Okay, so you can change your medical, and I think Virginia works this way. You can change your gender on your birth certificate, but you have to have proof from a healthcare provider that you've gone through the steps of medical transition. And there's a form for that. Look it up on Virginia. If you look up, Virginia changing marker on birth certificate, it'll come up, and there's actually a form that your healthcare provider has to fill out. And then a few states, not Virginia, unfortunately, allow for an X gender on birth certificates. So Virginia's not there yet. So if someone changes their gender marker on their birth certificate, X is not an option in Virginia. X is an option in Virginia for driver's licenses and state IDs, but not for birth certificates. Okay, and if you're not following any of this, you can go back and look at it later. All right, and then more on legal transition, you or other folks can go to transequality.org or the Movement Advancement Project. So this shows where trans people have legal protections in different areas. And in Virginia actually shows up fairly strong. It shows up medium strong around protections in all areas. Good for trans clients to know where they're protected. So good anti-discrimination laws overall for trans people in Virginia. All right. That's it. Sorry, I went a little over, but I got all the information in. It was fast at the end, but you will have the information in writing after this for your reference. Before we close, I know we're over, but I want to make time for questions if people have some, and of course, if people want to go, I understand that as well.
Thank you so much, Aaron. Everyone, if you have any questions, those who are still on, please, you can unmute yourself. You do not have to use the chat feature. Thank you, Natalie, for joining. Thank you, Jason.
Hey. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we're
all
good,
right. Thank
Aaron.
you all. All right. So one more thing. That's what I meant to show you my email address. There you go. So if any questions do come up, or after this, or you're shy to ask, or anything, if you want to give me feedback on this training, I welcome one-on-one feedback. Reach out to me on my email. I would love to hear it. This is like a pilot training. It's my first time doing this one, so I would love to hear feedback. It was great to be here again. Thank you for having me.